My official designation is Fire Lookout. Position 1080, assigned to the Shoshone National Forest District in Wyoming. My name is Samuel Greaves. But in the world of the U.S. Forest Service, you are your position first, and your name second. It's a world built on procedure, on checklists, on the reassuring certainty of protocol. That certainty is why I pursued this job with a kind of single-minded focus that borders on obsession. Getting here wasn't like applying for a summer job at a burger joint. The federal lookout community is small, and the turnover is low. These positions are coveted, seen as the last bastions of true solitude in a world that never stops talking. It took me 2 years. The first year, my application on USA jobs Gov vanished into a digital abyss. The second year, I did my research. I identified specific forests, called the ranger districts, and asked for the fire management office. I learned to sound professional, interested, and competent. I learned the language of fire danger ratings, of fuel types, of the difference between a man-made fire and one born from a dry lightning strike. I became a student of the job before I even had it. When the hiring list finally came out, I followed up. When I got the interview, I drove 4 states to do it in person. I wanted them to see that I wasn't a tourist looking for a quirky vacation. I was serious. This wasn't a job you took for the money. The pay is modest, just over $17 an hour. You take this job for the view, for the silence, for a life stripped down to its most essential elements. You take it for the soul. My post is the Clayton's Rest Lookout, perched on the summit of Blackhall Mountain. It's a name that doesn't appear on most public maps. A quiet dedication to Alfred Clayton, a crew boss who was one of the 15 men killed in the tragic Blackwater Fire of 1937. Not far from here. A grim piece of local history, a reminder of what we're all out here to prevent. The journey to Clayton's Rest is a lesson in progressive isolation. You start in Laramie, a town that feels like the edge of the civilized world. From there, you drive west, the asphalt giving way to a well-maintained gravel road that winds through the vast, rolling expanse of the Medicine Bow Road National Forest before you officially enter the Shoshone. The landscape is a stunning, brutal mix of montane forest and high-elevation prairie. Douglas, fir and lodgepole pine forests cling to the cooler, north-facing slopes, while the south-facing ones are a tapestry of mountain grasslands and hardy shrubs. The road gets narrower. The signs of civilization, fences, mailboxes, the occasional ranch, fall away. Finally, you reach a turnoff marked only by a Forest Service route number. This is where the real journey begins. The last 3 miles to the lookout are a rugged, single-lane track that demands a high-clearance, 4-wheel drive vehicle. The truck groaned and bucked over rocks and deep ruts, the tires spinning in the loose scree. It felt less like driving and more like a controlled ascent. With every 100 feet of elevation gained, the world fell away, and the silence grew deeper, broken only by the constant, pressing Wyoming wind that scores these peaks. And then, there it was, Clayton's Rest, a 15 by 15-foot cabin, walled with glass windows, sitting atop a 40-foot steel tower. It's a lonely sentinel against sky that feels impossibly large. I parked the truck, my legs unsteady after the rough drive, and made my way to the base of the tower. The previous lookout, a man named Henderson, was waiting for me. He was a classic old-timer, with skin like tan leather and eyes that seemed to hold the reflection of 1,000 empty horizons. The handover was brief, all business. He walked me through the basics. The propane stove and refrigerator. The wood stove for the bitterly cold nights that can happen even in July. The solar powered LED lights that provide a dim, yellow glow after sunset. He showed me the vault toilet a short walk from the tower and pointed out the direction of the nearest spring for water, though he advised me to rely on the weekly supply drops. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of pine, old paper, and propane. It was Spartan, functional. A simple bed that was more of a cot, a small table, and in the exact center of the room. The heart of the lookout, the Osborne Firefinder. It sat on its own dedicated podium, a heavy, circular steel table, with a topographic map of the surrounding 100,000 acres permanently affixed to its surface. The map was worn, stained with coffee rings and the ghosts of past calculations. The brass alidade, the sighting mechanism, gleamed dully in the afternoon light. "She's all yours," Henderson said, handing me the key to the cabin door. "Keep your eyes peeled. Radio in your weather at 071900. Log everything." He looked around the small space one last time, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Relief, maybe, or regret. He didn't offer any advice or quirky stories. He just nodded, descended the metal stairs, got into his own dusty pickup, and drove away, leaving me alone with the wind and the view. I spent the first hour just settling in, putting my food in the cupboards, unrolling my sleeping bag on the cot. It was then that I found it. I was running a dust cloth over the Firefinder, familiarizing myself with the map, tracing the contours of the mountains and valleys I would come to know intimately. My fingers brushed against something taped the underside of the heavy steel table. I knelt and peeled it off. It was a single sheet of thick, yellowed paper, folded twice. The text was typewritten, the ink faded but perfectly legible. At the top, in stark, simple letters, it read, "The Rules of Clayton's Rest Lookout." I unfolded it and read, so gyals up au summatab au suosa oto table 1 all rules of Clayton's Rest Lookout 1. Daily weather observations must be logged at 0700 and 1900 precisely. Your report to dispatch must be accurate. The report in your personal log, however, must omit any mention of precipitation, even if you are soaked to the bone. The mountain does not like to be reminded of what it cannot keep. 2. The Osborne Firefinder must be leveled and oriented to the designated point, Windy Mountain, azimuth 23 degrees 30, every morning. If the orientation is off by more than 1 full degree and cannot be corrected, do not use the Firefinder. Report your position as compromised due to instrument malfunction and rely only on your eyes. It is looking for you, and the Firefinder can be a window. 3. From dusk until dawn, the catwalk is off limits. The wind has teeth. 4. The herds of bighorn sheep Sovis canadensis are a natural part of the ecosystem. If you observe a herd moving in perfect unison, as if guided by a single mind, go inside the cabin and do not look at them again for 1 hour. They are not practicing. 5. You may hear voices on the radio static, especially during high-pressure weather systems. These are echoes. Do not respond to them, especially if they use your name. If you hear what sounds like a child crying, immediately switch to channel 7 and leave it there for the rest of the night. It is not an echo. 6. If you spot a fire and its smoke is perfectly, unnaturally white, do not report it. It is not for you. It will extinguish itself by sunrise. Watch it if you must, but do not record it in the official log. 7. Once per week, you will find a small, carved stone animal on the cabin's doorstep. Leave a single, unopened can of food, beans or fruit preferred in its place before sunset. This is the most important rule. I read the list twice, then a third time. A slow smile spread across my face. I let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded thin in the vast emptiness. It was a joke. It had to be. A prank left for the new guy. A classic bit of hazing. Or, more likely, the final testament of a man who had spent too many seasons alone. His mind frayed by the crushing loneliness. That was a known occupational hazard. I could picture Henderson, or some lookout before him, typing this up in the dead of night, amusing himself with these cryptic, nonsensical commands. The wind has teeth. Poetic, but absurd. I folded the paper and tucked it into the back of my personal logbook. A funny little souvenir of my first day. The next 2 days were a study in the beauty of routine. I fell into the rhythm of the mountain. I woke at dawn, the sky a riot of pink and orange. I made coffee on the propane stove, the hiss of the gas a welcome sound. My days were structured by the clock and the sky. Every 15 minutes, I would do a full 360-degree scan of the horizon with my binoculars, a slow, methodical sweep for the faintest wisp of smoke. I performed the daily maintenance on the firefinder, just as the manual dictated. I placed a level on the graduated rim, making minute adjustments with the leveling screws until the bubble was perfectly centered. I sighted the designated orientation point, Windy Mountain to the south, and confirmed the azimuth was a perfect 183 degrees, 30 minutes. The rest of the time, I simply existed. I read books. I wrote in my log. I watched the weather. Thunderstorms would materialize. Out of a clear blue sky, great bruised purple anvils of cloud that would march across the plains. Trailing curtains of rain and brilliant spears of lightning. The tower would groan and creak in the high winds, a constant reminder that I was in a man-made object perched precariously in the heart of raw, untamable nature. The isolation was total. The silence was profound, a physical presence that pressed in on you. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the presence of something ancient and vast. I felt like the only person left on Earth, and I loved it. I dismissed the strange list of rules as a forgotten piece of folklore. On the third night, the test came. A massive thunderstorm had rolled in, just after my 1900 weather report. It was a spectacular display. For over an hour, the world outside my glass walls was a chaos of wind, rain, and lightning. The storm was so close that the thunder wasn't a rumble. It was a physical concussion that shook the tower to its steel bones. I sat at the small table, watching the show, feeling a sense of profound awe. Then, as quickly as it arrived, the storm moved on, rumbling its way east. The rain softened to a drizzle and then stopped. The wind died down to its usual mournful sigh. A deep quiet settled over the mountain. And in that quiet, I heard it. It was faint at first, a high, thin sound that seemed to catch on the edges of the wind. A wail. I stood up and went to the window, peering out into the dripping darkness. I told myself it was just the wind, whistling through a rock formation, or maybe a coyote pup. But the sound came again, clearer this time. It was unmistakably the sound of a child crying, a desperate, lonely sob that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through me. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was impossible. The nearest road was miles away. No one could be out there. It was an auditory illusion, a trick of the exhausted mind, a phenomenon of acoustics in the strange mountain terrain. Then, I remembered. My blood ran cold. Rule find 5e: if you hear what sounds like a child crying, immediately switch to channel 7 and leave it there for the rest of the night. It is not an echo. My professional, rational mind screamed at me. It was nonsense, a coincidence. But the crying continued, a heartbreaking, chilling sound that scraped at my nerves. I felt a primal fear, an ancient instinct that whispered, "Something is wrong." Feeling like the world's biggest fool, I walked over to the radio console. My hand trembled as I reached for the channel selector knob. The main dispatch channel was silent, filled with a low hiss of static. The crying sound was still there, seeming to seep through the glass of the windows. I took a breath, my knuckles white as I gripped the knob. I turned it, the clicks loud in the silent cabin. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The moment the radio clicked onto channel 7, the crying stopped. It didn't fade out. It didn't trail off. It cut off, instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. The silence that rushed back in was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, and charged with a terrible new knowledge. The sound hadn't been coming through the windows. It had been in my head, or in the air, or broadcast on some impossible frequency, and the simple, physical act of turning a dial had silenced it. I stood frozen in front of the radio for what felt like an hour, listening to the empty hiss of an unused channel. The list wasn't a joke. It wasn't a prank. It was an instruction manual. And I had just followed the first rule. Sleep did not come easily after the incident with the radio. The silence that followed the flick of the channel dial was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the peaceful, empty silence of isolation I had craved. It was the tense, listening silence of a room, right after a scream. Every creak of the tower in the wind, every skittering sound on the roof, that was likely just a loose pebble, became a source of sharp, electric dread. I sat on the edge of my cot for hours, the list of rules spread on my knee, reading the typewritten words until they were burned into my memory. The prank had become a prophecy. The ramblings of a lonely man had become a survival guide. I kept the radio on channel 7 all night. The empty hiss a bizarre form of comfort. It was proof that I had done something right. I finally drifted into a shallow, restless sleep with the dim solar, powered lights still on, not wanting to be in complete darkness. I dreamt of static, of a child's face dissolving into a field of television snow. My alarm at 06:30 was a jarring intrusion. The sun was just beginning to crest the eastern peaks, painting the underside of the clouds in soft shades of pink and orange. It was a beautiful, serene morning that felt like a cruel joke. My first thought was of the rules. Specifically, Rule 81. Daily weather observations must be logged at 0700 and 1900 precisely. Your report to dispatch must be accurate. The report in your personal log, however, must omit any mention of precipitation, even if you are soaked to the bone. The mountain does not like to be reminded of what it cannot keep. The storm last night had been intense. The catwalk was still slick with moisture, and the ground below was dark and damp. My official training, my identity as position 1080, screamed at me to log the rainfall. It was a critical piece of data for assessing fire danger. To omit it was not just a breach of protocol. It was a dereliction of my primary duty. But the memory of the crying and the sudden, chilling silence that followed my obedience was a far more compelling argument. At 06:55, I sat before the radio console, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I switched the channel back to the main dispatch frequency. The familiar voice of the morning dispatcher, a woman named Mary, crackled to life, running through the call signs for the other lookouts. When she called, "Clayton's Rest, position 1080, I picked up the microphone, my palms slick with sweat. "Position 1080, good morning," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I read the temperature, the wind speed and direction, the barometric pressure, the visibility. I reported the cloud cover as broken cirrostratus. And then I paused. I could feel the unspoken word on my tongue: precipitation. I swallowed it down. End of report. I finished. Acknowledged, 1080. Clear skies out there, Mary said, and moved on to the next call sign. No lightning bolt struck the tower. No monstrous voice boomed from the radio. Nothing happened. I let out a breath. I didn't realize I'd been holding for 5 minutes. I turned to my official logbook and recorded the weather data exactly as I had reported it. Then, I opened my personal log, the one where I'd tucked the list of rules. I wrote down the date, the time, and the weather, and I left the line for precipitation completely blank. It felt like a conspiracy, a secret pact between me and whatever entity had written those rules. Next came the firefinder, the morning ritual that had once been a comforting piece of routine, now felt like a high stakes test. I approached the heavy instrument with a new, fearful reverence. Rule 52 echoed in my mind. If the orientation is off by more than 1 full degree and cannot be corrected, do not use the firefinder. Report your position as compromised due to instrument malfunction, and rely only on your eyes. It is looking for you, and the firefinder can be a window. A window. A window to what? Or for what? I placed the spirit level on the graduated rim, my hands shaking so badly that the bubble danced wildly. I had to brace my wrists on the steel table to steady them. I adjusted the leveling screws with painstaking care, my eyes glued to the bubble until it settled perfectly in the center. Then, the orientation. I loosened the adjustment screws and swiveled the entire upper plate, peering through the rear sight, aligning the vertical horsehair of the front sight with the distant peak of Windy Mountain. I held my breath and checked the vernier scale. 183 degrees, 30 minutes. Perfect. A wave of relief so profound it made me dizzy washed over me. The window was closed. For today. The day passed in a haze of hyper-vigilance. Every 15 minutes, I did my sweep of the horizon. But I wasn't just looking for smoke anymore. I was looking for anything else. I watched the herds of bighorn sheep grazing on the slopes below, my binoculars trained on them, searching for that perfect unison. The rule described. They moved like normal animals, scattered and independent. And each time I confirmed this, I felt a small measure of calm return. The wind picked up in the afternoon, and I found myself flinching at its howl, imagining teeth in its passing. I stayed inside, away from the catwalk, even though it was broad daylight. Around 1400, I saw it. To the northeast, a thin column was rising against the brilliant blue sky. My training kicked in instantly. I grabbed my binoculars. It was smoke. But something was wrong. It was a pure, brilliant, almost glowing white. Not the dirty gray of a wood fire, or the dark black of an oil-based fire. It was the color of bleached bone, of fresh snow. It rose in a perfectly straight, unwavering pillar, completely unaffected by the wind that was still gusting against my tower. Rule Phase 6. If you spot a fire and its smoke is perfectly, unnaturally white, do not report it. It is not for you. It will extinguish itself by sunrise. This was the ultimate test. My one and only job was to report fires. To see smoke and remain silent was the cardinal sin of my profession. My hand hovered over the radio microphone. What if it was a real fire? What if a campsite, a cabin, a person was burning down there? My fault. But the smoke, it was just so wrong. It didn't roil or billow. It just ascended. A solid, unwavering line of white drawn straight up into the sky. I thought about the crying. I thought about the silence on Channel 7. I lowered my hand. I spent the next 3 hours glued to that spot, watching the white smoke through my binoculars. I didn't log it. I didn't photograph it. I just watched. It never wavered, never thinned, never dissipated. It was a monument of smoke. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, the white pillar seemed to glow with its own internal luminescence. And then, just as the last sliver of sun vanished, the smoke winked out of existence. It didn't blow away. It was there 1 second and simply gone the next. As if it had never been. The sun had set. My shift was over. I made my 1900 report, my voice a dry croak, once again omitting the day's bizarre events. Shaken, I decided to make myself some dinner. I climbed down the steep metal stairs from the cabin, my legs feeling weak. The air at the base of the tower was cool and smelled of pine and dust. I took a step toward the path to the vault toilet and froze. There, on the concrete footing of the tower stairs, directly in my path, was a small object. It was a stone, carved into the shape of an animal. It was about the size of my thumb, worked from a piece of dark, smooth river rock. The carving was crude, ancient looking, but unmistakable. It was a bygone sheep. Its horns curled back in an exaggerated spiral, and its legs were tucked beneath it, as if it were lying down. It felt heavy in my hand, and strangely warm, as if it had been sitting in the sun all day, even though this spot had been in shadow for hours. Rule Phase 7. Once per week, you will find a small, carved stone animal on the cabin's doorstep. Leave a single, unopened can of food as beans or fruit preferred in its place before sunset. This is the most important rule. My blood turned to ice. It was the 7th day of my post. I scrambled back up the stairs, my movements clumsy with panic. I fumbled through my supplies, my hands shaking. Beans or fruit? I grabbed a can of peaches, my fingers closing around the cool metal. I clattered back down the stairs. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, the last light fading fast. I placed the can of peaches exactly where the stone carving had been. I snatched up the stone animal and retreated, back up the tower, locking the door behind me, my heart hammering like it wanted out of my chest. I sat at my table, the stone sheep in my trembling hand, and stared out the window into the deepening twilight. I had followed the rules. I had silenced the crying child, ignored the impossible fire, and paid the strange toll. I was no longer just a lookout. I was an accomplice. And then I saw them. On the ridge to the west, silhouetted against the last glow of the sky, was the herd of bygone sheep I had been watching all day. But they weren't scattered anymore. They were standing in a perfect line, all facing my tower. There must have been 30 of them. And as I watched, my breath catching in my throat, they began to move. Not with the scattered, individual motions of a herd, but as one. They took a single, synchronized step forward. Then another. They moved with the chilling, unnatural precision of a single organism, their heads held at the exact same angle, their legs moving in perfect, silent unison. They were not practicing. My retreat from the window was not a choice. It was a primal, instinctual flight. I didn't just see the bygone sheep move in unison. I felt it in my bones, a deep, resonant wrongness that vibrated up through the steel legs of the tower. I slammed the cabin door shut, my back hitting the wood with a thud, and fumbled with the lock. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. I scrambled away from the windows, crouching behind the small cot as if the thin mattress could offer some protection. Rule Way 4. If you observe a herd of bygone sheep, Ovis canadensis moving in perfect unison, as if guided by a single mind, go inside the cabin and do not look at them again for 1 hour. They are not practicing. 1 hour. 60 minutes. 3,600 seconds. Time had become a physical entity, a thick, suffocating medium I had to wade through. I pressed my hands over my ears, but I couldn't block out the sound of my own frantic heartbeat. What were they doing out there? Were they still moving? Were they surrounding the tower? the rational part of my brain, the part that had confidently driven up this mountain only a week ago, was screaming that this was a stress-induced hallucination. The crushing loneliness, the altitude, the sheer emptiness of this place. It was a known occupational hazard. Men went mad in places like this, but the cold, smooth weight of the carved stone sheep in my pocket was a tangible argument against that theory. The silence from the radio on Channel 7 was another. This was real. I didn't dare look at a clock. I counted. I counted my breaths. I counted the rivets in the steel beams above my head. I recited multiplication tables in my head. Anything to keep from looking out the window. The sun had set, and the world outside had descended into an inky, star-dusted black. After what felt like an eternity, I risked a glance at my watch. An hour and 12 minutes had passed. I let out a shaky breath and slowly, cautiously, rose to my feet. I crept to the window and peered out toward the western ridge. It was empty. The sheep were gone. There was only the wind, which now seemed to whisper and conspire as it flowed around the cabin. The next few days passed in a state of what I can only describe as functional terror. The simple, grounding routine of the lookout had become a minefield of potential horrors. Every morning check of the firefinder was that the orientation to Windy Mountain was still true, that the window remained closed. Every 15-minute scan of the horizon was a search not just for smoke, but for smoke that was the wrong color. My life was no longer governed by the U.S. Forest Service manual, but by a single sheet of yellowed, typewritten paper. I was a prisoner in my glass cage, and the rules were my warden. The nights were the worst. The profound, absolute darkness of the wilderness was no longer a comfort. It was a canvas, and my imagination, fueled by fear, painted monstrous things upon it. This was when Rule 23 began to haunt me. From dusk until dawn, the catwalk is off limits. The wind has teeth. I had dismissed it as poetry, a metaphor for the fierce winds that scoured the peak. Now, I wasn't so sure. On the 10th night, a storm blew in, not a thunderstorm, but a dry, violent gale that made the tower moan and shudder on its foundations. I was trying to read by the dim solar-powered light, but the noise was too distracting. And beneath the howl of the wind, I began to hear another sound, a rhythmic, scraping noise. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It sounded like it was coming from the catwalk right outside my door. I froze, the book falling from my hands. It sounded like metal on metal, or bone on metal. I strained to listen, my entire being focused on that sound. It was drowned out for a moment by a particularly violent gust, and then it returned, closer this time. It was accompanied by something else. A wet, tearing sound, like a dog worrying a piece of meat. My mind flashed to the rule. The wind has teeth. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal, horrifying warning. I pictured a set of immense, invisible jaws, clamping down on the steel grating of the catwalk, scraping, chewing, testing. I crawled into my cot, pulled the sleeping bag over my head, and lay there, trembling until the sun finally rose, the scraping sounds having long since faded with the wind. I knew I couldn't continue like this. I was fraying at the edges. my grip on reality loosening with every passing hour. I needed answers. The next afternoon, during a period of calm, clear weather, I started my search. Previous lookouts often left things behind. A paperback novel, a spare can opener. Henderson had been all business, but surely there were traces of others. In the bottom of a cupboard filled with cleaning supplies, I found them a stack of old, canvas-bound logbooks. They spanned 30 years. I opened the most recent one, Henderson's. His entries were sparse, professional. Weather reports, maintenance notes, fire sightings. All by the book. But as I flipped toward the end of his last season, the entries grew shorter. I found one from a date in late September. Windy all night. Bad air. A week later, visitors again. Left a gift. No smoke. Visitors. The only visitors I'd had were the ones who left the stone carving. I put his log aside and picked up an older one from the 1980s. The lookout's name was Arthur. His handwriting was a neat, precise cursive. For the first few months, his entries were as mundane as Henderson's. Then, they changed. He started including sketches in the margins. A drawing of a spiral. A crude rendering of a sheep with too many horns. One entry gave me a jolt of cold fear. Heard the crying again. Channel 7 is quiet tonight. Another, a few weeks later, was even more disturbing. The white smoke is back. It feels closer this time. I think it knows I'm watching. I frantically dug through the rest of the logs. The pattern was the same. Each lookout started their tenure with crisp, professional observations. But as the seasons wore on, the entries would become tinged with paranoia and fear. Cryptic references to the Watchers, the Silent Herd, the man on the radio. The final logbook in the stack was from the early 70s. The lookout's name was Miller. His last entry was a single, shaky sentence. Firefinder is off by 2 degrees. The window is open. It sees me. The rest of the pages were blank. My blood ran cold. Miller hadn't just quit. He'd gone silent. The next evening, I was making my 1900 report. Mary the dispatcher was running through the usual checklist. Her voice was a comforting, normal presence in my increasingly abnormal world. And visibility 1080, she asked. 100 miles plus, I said, my voice hoarse. No smoke. Acknowledge 1080. Stay safe up there. You too, Mary. 1080, clear. I set the microphone down. In the crackle of static that followed, I heard it. It was not Mary's voice. It was a whisper, low and dry, like dead leaves, skittering across pavement. And it was right in my ear, as if someone were standing right behind me. Samuel. I stopped breathing. It was not an echo. It was not my imagination. It was my name spoken with a chilling, ancient familiarity. My hand shot out for the microphone, my training, my instinct, my humanity screaming at me to respond. Who is this? Rule 25. Do not respond to them, especially if they use your name. I snatched my hand back as if the radio were red hot. My heart was a wild bird beating against my ribs. The static hissed, and the voice was gone. But the silence it left behind was worse. It knew my name. The formal designation of Position 1080 was a shield, a uniform. But Samuel was me. It had peeled back my armor and spoken to the man underneath. The next 2 days were a blur. I barely ate. I slept in fits and starts, waking up from nightmares of whispers and empty static. My only solace was that it was the 14th day of my post. The supply truck was due. A human face. A real voice. A connection to the world that wasn't trying to unmake me. At around 1500, I started scanning the long, winding gravel road that led to the base of the mountain. I swept my binoculars back and forth, desperate for the dust cloud of the approaching Forest Service pickup. An hour passed. Nothing. My anxiety grew. Maybe they were late. Maybe a tree was down across the road. Then I saw something. It wasn't a truck. It was a figure. A single person walking. They were still miles away, a tiny black speck against the brown of the road. But they were moving with a steady, relentless pace. No one walked up this road. It was miles of rugged, exposed terrain with no water. It was suicide. I kept the binoculars trained on the figure, my hands shaking so badly the image swam in and out of focus. They never stopped, never slowed. Just a steady, inexorable march directly toward my tower. This wasn't the supply driver. This wasn't a lost hiker. This was something else. This was a visitor. The figure on the road was a relentless, heat-shimmering dot that slowly resolved into a man. My binoculars were glued to my eyes, the rubber cups digging into my sockets. I watched him for over an hour as he made his way up the winding service road, a journey that should have taken half a day on foot. He never stopped to rest, never paused for water. His pace was steady, unnatural, like a clockwork machine marching toward a single, preordained point, the base of my tower. As he drew closer, a cold, familiar dread washed over me. I recognized the faded Forest Service ball cap, the stooped shoulders, the worn leather boots. It was Henderson. He looked different. The man who had left my post 2 weeks ago was weathered but solid. The man now climbing the final, steep grade to the tower was a hollowed out version of himself. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his cheekbones, and his eyes. Even from a distance, I could feel them, were wide and haunted, staring at something beyond the physical landscape. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a year. I didn't unlock the door. I stood inside my glass box, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs, and watched as he reached the base of the tower. He didn't call out my name. He didn't look up. He simply sat on a large rock, his back to me, and stared out at the vast, empty expanse to the east. He sat there for a long time, utterly still, as the afternoon sun began its slow descent. Finally, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I unlocked the door, the click echoing loudly in the stillness, and stepped out onto the catwalk. The wind immediately whipped at my clothes. "Henderson," I called out, my voice thin and reedy. He turned his head slowly, his neck creaking like old leather. He looked up at me, and his eyes were pits of exhaustion and something else, resignation. "It's time, kid," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Supply drop." He gestured to a small, worn leather satchel at his feet. It was not the bi-weekly delivery of food and water I had been expecting. "What's going on?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "The supply truck, where is it?" "There is no truck," he said flatly. "Not for us. Not anymore." He stood up, his joints popping, and began the slow, deliberate climb up the tower stairs. I backed away from the door, my hand reaching for the handle, but I didn't retreat. I had to know. He reached the catwalk and stopped a few feet from me, the wind howling around us. He smelled of dust, sweat, and a deep, underlying scent of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. "You've been following the rules, haven't you?" he asked. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. I knew you would. You have the look, serious, committed. The crying child, I whispered. The white smoke. The sheep. He nodded slowly. Good. You learn fast. Faster than Miller, anyway. The name from the old logbook sent a fresh spike of ice through my veins. What happened to him? What happened to all of them? They stopped following the rules, Henderson said, his gaze drifting to the horizon. Or they tried to leave. You can't just quit. This isn't that kind of job. You don't get to retire. You get relieved. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something like pity in his eyes. This place, this mountain, it needs a watcher. It's not about forest fires. Kid, it's never been about the fires. Then what is it? I asked, my voice barely audible over the wind. What are we watching for? Not for, he corrected, a grim smile touching his lips. We're watching for it. We're the part of the trap that makes the bait look real. We give it a voice on the radio. We give it eyes on the horizon. We're the caretakers, the wardens. He stepped past me and into the cabin. I followed, my mind reeling. He walked directly to the Osborne firefinder, the heart of the room, and ran a trembling hand over its cool, metal surface. This is the most important part, he murmured, more to himself than to me. The pact. The agreement. He looked at the small, carved stone sheep I had placed on the table. The weekly offering shows you're compliant. The blank logs show you're discreet. Ignoring the white smoke shows you know your place. But this, he patted the firefinder. This is about keeping the peace. He leaned down, his eyes scanning the base of the heavy instrument. Rule Fate 2, he whispered. The window. Before I could react, he slammed his hand down on the side of the steel table. The entire, heavy apparatus shuddered, and with a sickening metallic groan, it shifted on its podium. I lunged forward, but he held up a hand, his strength surprising. He commanded. It's my time to be relieved. I scrambled for the spirit level, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I placed it on the graduated rim. The bubble, which I had so painstakingly centered every morning, was now hard against the side of the glass. It was off. It was off by at least 2 degrees. The window is open. Henderson breathed, a sound of profound, terrifying relief. He gestured for me to look. See what you're really guarding, he said. My training, the rules, every instinct screamed at me not to, but I was compelled. I stepped up to the firefinder. I looked through the rear sight, my eye aligning with the vertical horsehair of the front sight. But I wasn't looking at windy mountain anymore. The landscape outside the glass walls of the cabin was wrong. It wasn't a monster, not in any way I could have conceived. It was worse. The very fabric of reality seemed to be warping, twisting around a point of focus that the firefinder was now aimed at. The distant mountains buckled and flowed like fabric. The sky was no longer blue, but a bruised, shifting violet, and it was filled with what I can only describe as the impression of eyes. Countless, ancient, and utterly indifferent. The wind was no longer just wind. It was a voice, a chorus of whispers that spoke my name, not just Samuel, but my full name, my date of birth, the name of my first pet. It was peeling me open, layer by layer, with the sheer, crushing weight of its knowledge. I screamed and stumbled back, clutching my head. The world outside snapping back to normalment. I broke my gaze. Henderson was watching me, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. "You see now," he said. "It's always there, watching, waiting. The rules keep the window closed. They keep it content. But someone has to be here to follow them. Someone has to be the anchor." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a single, yellowed sheet of paper, identical to the one I had found. "My replacement," he said, holding it out to me. "You're a good lookout, Samuel. You're serious. You'll last longer than I did." I stared at him, at the paper, at the malevolent stillness of the firefinder. I thought of the logbooks, of Miller's final, terrified entry. I thought of the crying child, a lure for some unspeakable hunger. I thought of the synchronized sheep, extensions of a single alien will. This wasn't a job. It was a sentence. "What if I refuse?" I asked, my voice shaking. Henderson's smile was gone. "Then the window stays open, and it will take its payment. It will take you. It will take me. It will scour this mountain clean. It's happened before. That's why they built a new tower in '63. He was offering me a choice that was no choice at all. Become the jailer, or be consumed with the prison. My life, my sanity, in exchange for holding back, whatever that was." Slowly, my hand reached out and took the paper from him. As my fingers closed around it, a sense of profound, chilling calm settled over me. The fear didn't vanish, but it was replaced by a cold, hard sense of purpose. The screaming panic in my mind went quiet, replaced by the low, steady hum of duty. Henderson watched the change come over me. He nodded once, a final, wary acknowledgement. "Good," he whispered. He turned and walked to the cabin door, not like a man leaving, but like a man finally being dismissed. He didn't look back. He walked out onto the catwalk, and into the wind, and simply dissolved. He didn't fall. He didn't fly. He just unraveled, like smoke, and was gone. I stood alone in the cabin for a long time. Then, with methodical, practiced movements, I went to the firefinder. I carefully loosened the orientation screws, took hold of the heavy steel plate, and began the painstaking process of realigning it to windy mountain, azimuth 183°30. I centered the bubble. I closed the window. Dao Dao Yazon and Ishiguanchi now Churyer Dao Dao Zerdo Churyer Sijo Jino Dao Surjao Ya Churyer has passed. The seasons turn. The supply truck never comes, but once a week, I find a small, carved stone animal on my doorstep, and I leave a can of peaches in its place. I log the weather, omitting the rain. I listen to the static on Channel 7 when the crying starts. I watch the white smoke rise and vanish, and I do not report it. I am no longer Samuel Greaves. That man is a ghost, a memory. I am position 1080. This morning, a new pickup truck, a dusty Forest Service green, groaned its way up the final 3 miles of road. A young man got out. He has the look. Serious. Committed. He thinks he's here for the solitude, for the view, for a life stripped down to its essentials. I will walk him through the basics. The propane stove, the vault toilet, the fire finder. I will hand him the key, and when he is not looking, I will tape a single, yellowed sheet of paper to the underside of the heavy, steel table. The cycle must continue. The mountain needs its watcher, and my position is lookout. My name is Alex Thompson. It feels important to state that for the record, to anchor myself to a reality that seems to be slipping away with each passing hour. Before I took this job, I was an urban planner, a man who dealt in concrete grids, traffic flow simulations, and the predictable, organized chaos of city life. My world was one of blueprints and bylaws, a place where every problem had a logical, man-made solution. I found comfort in that order. But order has a way of breaking down, not just in cities, but in a man's life. After a particularly brutal year, a dissolved engagement and the quiet, lingering illness of my father, the city I had helped shape began to feel like a cage of my own design. The noise was no longer a symphony of life, but a cacophony of failures. The towering buildings didn't represent ambition anymore. They just cast long, suffocating shadows. I needed an escape. Not a vacation, but a fundamental severing from the world I knew. I craved silence, isolation, a place where the only demands were primal and simple. When I saw the posting for a fire lookout in the heart of Blackwood National Forest, it felt less like a job opportunity and more like a lifeline. 6 months of solitude. The description read, vigilance, self-sufficiency, and a comfort with isolation are essential. I was all of those things, or at least, I desperately wanted to be. The hiring process was surprisingly remote and impersonal. A few emails, a background check, and a single, crackly phone call with a man who introduced himself only as Mr. Henderson. His voice was gravelly, tired, as if he'd spent a lifetime sighing. He asked me if I was running from something. I gave him a practiced, professional answer about seeking tranquility and reconnecting with nature. He grunted, a sound that conveyed both disbelief and a complete lack of interest. The forest doesn't care about your reasons, Mr. Thompson, he'd said. It only cares that you follow the rules. At the time, I assumed he meant the standard Park Service protocols. I was wrong. The journey to my new home, Watchtower Station 4, was a lesson in gradual erasure. I started on a 4-lane highway, which bled into a 2-lane state road, then a winding county asphalt strip. Soon, that gave way to a gravel road. The stones pinging against the undercarriage of my beat up sedan like a final, scattered applause from civilization. The last 10 miles were a dirt track, a mere suggestion of a road, hemmed in so tightly by ancient pines that the afternoon sun was reduced to a few dappled coins on the forest floor. My cell phone signal had vanished an hour ago. The radio hissed with static. I was utterly, completely alone. The tower, when I finally saw it, was both magnificent and terrifying. It was a small 12 by 12-foot room, walled with glass, perched atop a skeletal steel frame that rose 100 feet into the air. It stood on a small, rocky clearing on the crest of a mountain, a lone sentinel overlooking a sea of green that stretched to every horizon. It looked like a cage tossed into the sky. After hauling my gear, 6 months of non-perishable food, books, clothes, and a satellite phone for emergencies only. Up the seemingly endless flights of stairs, I finally stepped into my new home. The view was breathtaking. I could see for 100 miles in every direction. Mountains rippled in the distance like the spine of some colossal, sleeping beast. The sheer scale of it was humbling. It made my world of traffic jams and broken hearts feel laughably insignificant. For the first time in a year, I felt a sense of peace. The inside of the tower was Spartan. A single cot, a small desk with a radio console, a wood-burning stove, a propane-powered mini-fridge, and the famous Osborne fire finder, a complex brass instrument of maps and sights used to pinpoint smoke. It was clean, but it held the faint, lingering scent of its previous occupant's old coffee, wood smoke, and something else. Something like old paper and faint, metallic tang of fear. It was while I was putting away my supplies that I found it. Taped to the inside of the food locker door was a single sheet of A4 paper, yellowed and soft with age. It had been laminated poorly, with edges that were peeling and cloudy. On it, written in a frantic, spidery scrawl that shifted from neat block letters to a desperate cursive, was a list. The title, underlined 3 times, read, "Rules for Staying Alive." Read them. Do not break them. I chuckled, pulling the sheet from the door. It felt like a classic rookie hazing prank. This is what it said. 1. The hatch to the ground stairs must be locked from the inside no later than sunset. Check the lock twice. There are no second chances. 2. Between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m., you may hear sounds from below. Familiar sounds. A crying child, a woman singing, a dog barking. It is the forest testing you. It is not real. Do not open the hatch. Do not shine your light down there. Acknowledge it and you make it real. 3. If you see a fire you know isn't a fire, one that moves too fast, or burns with a color that isn't natural, blue, green, purple, do not log it as a fire. Do not look at it for more than a few seconds. In your morning report, log it as atmospheric interference or unconfirmed seismic light. They will know what it means. Sometimes in the rain, you will see a face in the glass looking in. It will not have eyes. Do not scream. Do not react. It is only a reflection of your own fear. It feeds on acknowledgement. Turn your back to it and focus on your duties. It will eventually fade. 5. Do not leave the tower during a thunderstorm. The lightning is the least of your worries. 6. If you hear your own voice calling for help from the woods, it is not you. It is learning. Stay inside. 7. Once a month, on the new moon, leave a portion of your rations on the platform outside the hatch. A can of meat, some salted crackers. It must be salted. Do not watch to see what takes it. In the morning it will be gone. This is a payment. Do not miss a payment. I read the list twice, a wide grin spreading across my face. It was elaborate. I had to give them that. We face in the glass. Unconfirmed seismic light. It was wonderfully creative. The previous lookout must have been a budding horror writer, slowly going mad from the isolation. I folded the paper, tucked it into the back of a logbook on the desk, and forgot about it. The first day was idyllic. I organized my space, tested the radio equipment, and spent hours just watching the clouds drift across the vast, empty sky. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, I remembered the first rule on the list. The hatch must be locked by sunset. I hesitated. It was absurd. The hatch was a heavy steel trapdoor at the top of the stairs, leading onto the small catwalk that wrapped around the cabin. The only way up or down. Locking it felt silly, melodramatic. But then, a breeze rattled the glass panes of the tower, a low, mournful sound. The forest was darkening, the endless trees melting into a single, impenetrable shadow. The feeling of peace I'd had earlier was being replaced by a profound sense of exposure. I was 100 feet in the air, in a glass box, miles from another human being. Just for the hell of it, I muttered to myself. I walked out onto the catwalk. The wind was colder now. I pulled the heavy trapdoor shut. It closed with a deep, resonating thump. I then slid the thick steel bolt across. It was an old, heavy mechanism that took some effort. It clicked into place with a sound of absolute finality. For good measure, as the rules suggested, I checked it twice. It was solid. Back inside, I made myself some instant coffee and settled in with a book. The sun vanished completely, and a darkness unlike any I had ever known fell over the world. There were no city lights, no street lamps, just an inky, star-dusted blackness. The silence was absolute. At first, around 9 p.m., I heard the first sound. A faint tick, tick, tick against the steel of the catwalk outside. I rationalized it instantly. A branch carried by the wind. A bird. But the sound was rhythmic. It moved along the catwalk towards the hatch. Then came a soft, scraping sound. Scry-ape, like fingernails dragging on metal. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. This was ridiculous. It was an animal. A raccoon, maybe. They could climb anything. I stood up, my coffee forgotten, and listened. The scraping stopped, right over the spot where the hatch was. Then came the tapping. 3 distinct, deliberate taps on the steel door. Tap, tap, not an animal. Animals don't knock. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Mr. Henderson playing a prank. Did he hike all the way out here in the dark just to scare the new guy? It seemed impossible. The sound was too close, too immediate. I crept towards the door that led from the cabin to the catwalk. My hand hovered over the doorknob. The rule flashed in my mind. Do not open the hatch. This wasn't the hatch, but it led to it. I stayed my hand. I stood there, in the dark, for what felt like eternity, just listening. The silence returned, now heavier, more menacing than before. Whatever was out there was waiting. After 10 minutes of absolute stillness, I finally convinced myself it was my imagination. My city, frayed nerves playing tricks on me in this new, unnerving environment. I tried to go back to my book, but the words swam before my eyes. Every creak of the tower, every sigh of the wind, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. I decided to turn in early, hoping sleep would reset my sanity. I was drifting in that shallow space, between wakefulness and sleep when the second sound began. It was just after midnight. It was a voice. A woman's voice, faint, carried on the wind from the forest below. It was singing a lullaby, a tune I vaguely recognized but couldn't place. It was beautiful, but its presence here, in this impossible wilderness, was monstrous. Rule Fate 2. You may hear sounds from below. Familiar sounds. It is not real. My blood ran cold. This couldn't be happening. It was a prank. It had to be a prank. A hidden speaker somewhere. Some elaborate system set up to terrify the lookouts. Then the voice changed. It stopped singing. It started to speak. And it spoke my name. It was Sarah's voice, my ex-fiancée. The sound of her voice, so clear, so perfect, hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just a recording. It had all her inflections. The slight lilt when she was worried. The soft timbre that I had fallen in love with. Alex, can you hear me? I'm down here. My car broke down. I was so worried. I came to find you. I shot upright in my cot, my heart a frantic drum. My mind was a battlefield. One side, the logical planner, screamed that this was impossible. Sarah was 1,000 miles away. She didn't even know exactly where this tower was. The other side of my brain, the part that still ached for her, was being ripped apart. It sounded so real, so desperate.
Alex, please! It's dark and I'm scared!
I can see your light. Please, just answer me. Her voice called, closer now. It sounded like it was right at the base of the tower. I wanted to run to the radio. I wanted to scream her name into the microphone. I wanted to throw open the hatch and shine my flashlight down and find her. My hand was shaking, reaching for the heavy-duty torch on my desk. Acknowledge it, and you make it real. The words from the list echoed in my head, a cold counterpoint to Sarah's desperate pleas. This was the test. The forest testing me. What the hell did that even mean?
Please, Alex! I love you! Don't leave me out here!
The voice broke, turning into a sob. A sob I had heard before during our final, tear-filled argument. It was a sound precision engineered to destroy me. I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. Not real, not real, not real. I whispered, the words a desperate mantra. It was a trick. A hallucination brought on by the altitude and the isolation. But it was so perfect. The thing in the woods, whatever it was, it had reached into my memories and pulled out my most painful, vulnerable moments. The sobbing continued for what felt like hours. I stayed on my cot, trembling, fighting the overwhelming urge to respond. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. To deny that sound, to deny that part of myself that wanted to believe she was there, was a form of torture. Finally, as the first hint of gray light began to soften the eastern sky, the voice faded away, replaced by the natural, waking sounds of the forest. I was drenched in a cold sweat, utterly exhausted but wide awake. I stumbled to the window and looked out. The sea of trees was calm, shrouded in a gentle morning mist. There was no broken down car, no footprints in the damp earth around the tower's base that I could see from my vantage point. Nothing. My eyes fell on the logbook on the desk, with the laminated list of rules tucked inside. It wasn't a prank. I knew that now. It wasn't the ramblings of a madman. It was a survival guide. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, more than the mountain air, that this was only the beginning. There were still so many rules left to learn. Sleep did not come. After the voice of my dead fiancé faded with the dawn, I was left in a state of hyper-vigilant exhaustion. The sun rose, painting the vast wilderness in hues of gold and rose, a sight that would have filled me with profound joy just 24 hours earlier. Now, it only served to illuminate the stage of my terror. The beauty of the forest felt like a mask, a beautiful face, hiding something ancient and predatory. I spent the first hour of daylight with the laminated list spread out on the desk, my coffee growing cold beside it. The smudged, desperate handwriting no longer seemed like a joke. It was a testament, a warning from a predecessor who had either died here or fled in terror. I was an urban planner. I believed in systems, in cause and effect, in rules that govern the physical world. But the rules on this page were of a different kind. They weren't about safety protocols or park regulations. They were about managing the paranormal, about navigating a reality that operated on a logic of pure nightmare. My day was a strange mix of the mundane and the terrifying. I performed my duties with robotic precision, my mind a million miles away. Every 15 minutes, I would stand, walk a slow circle around the glass-walled room, and scan the horizon with my binoculars. I noted the wind's speed, the cloud cover, the humidity, logging it all in a neat, steady hand that betrayed the tremor in my soul. The routine was a flimsy shield against the paranoia that was taking root in my heart. Every gust of wind was the prelude to a whisper. Every shadow that danced among the trees was a figure watching me. The forest was no longer a collection of trees. It was a single, living entity, and I was a foreign body it was trying to expel. The day remained clear and bright, a blessing I did not take for granted. The thought of rain, of clouds obscuring my view, filled me with a primal dread. The sun was my only ally, keeping the deepest shadows at bay. The silence, which I had craved, was now my enemy. It was an empty canvas on which my fear painted 1,000 horrifying possibilities. Late in the afternoon, my routine was shattered. I was scanning the northern ridge, a dense stretch of old-growth pine about 10 miles out. And then I saw it. Smoke. Except it wasn't smoke. It was a thin, vertical pillar of the something. I raised the binoculars, my knuckles white. Rule Fate 3. If you see a fire you know isn't a fire, one that moves too fast, or burns with a color that isn't natural, blue, green, purple, do not log it as a fire. This fire was purple, a deep, sickening violet, like a bruise on the sky. It didn't billow or plume like a real fire. It stood in a perfectly straight, unwavering column. It didn't flicker, it pulsed, with a slow, rhythmic beat, like a diseased heart. My training screamed at me to get on the radio, to call in the coordinates, to report the blaze before it could spread. That was my job, my entire purpose for being here. But the rule held me back. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the violet column began to move. It slid through the forest, impossibly fast, not consuming the trees but passing through them. The ancient pines were untouched by its passage. It moved against the wind, a flagrant violation of physics. I kept the binoculars trained on it, and a wave of nausea washed over me. Looking at it felt wrong, like trying to comprehend a shape that shouldn't exist. It seemed to bend the light around it, and for a terrifying second, I thought I saw things moving within the violet light. Writhing, indistinct forms that my brain refused to process. Do not look at it for more than a few seconds. I tore the binoculars from my eyes, my heart pounding. I stumbled back from the window, gasping for breath. My eyes ached. I could still see the violet afterimage burned onto my retinas. I felt a profound sense of violation, as if that unnatural light had seen me, had looked back at me through the lenses and marked me. My hands shook as I sat at the desk to fill out the daily report. Under the section for observations, my pen hovered. My duty, my entire professional history, told me to describe what I saw. But the frantic scrawl on the laminated page whispered a different instruction. Log it as atmospheric interference or unconfirmed seismic light. They will know what it means, they. Who were they? Mr. Henderson, the Park Service, or some other shadowier organization that understood the true nature of this forest. With a sense of dread and complicity, I wrote 4:17 p.m. Unconfirmed seismic light observed on northern ridge. Lasted approximately 2 minutes. No further activity. The words felt like a lie and a prayer. I had followed the rule. I could only hope it was enough. As evening approached, the sky began to curdle. The brilliant blue was swallowed by a mass of bruised-looking clouds that rolled in from the west. The temperature dropped. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful cry that vibrated through the steel frame of the tower. A storm was coming. Rule Feint 5. Do not leave the tower during a thunderstorm. The lightning is the least of your worries. I checked the bolt on the hatch for the third time since sunset. It was secure. The first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the glass, and soon it was a torrential downpour, a wall of water that erased the world. The lightning started, silent flashes that lit the landscape in stark, monochrome detail, followed seconds later by claps of thunder, so loud they shook the tower to its foundations. I felt like a sailor in a crow's nest, tossed on a stormy sea. I tried to distract myself by making dinner. I was chopping vegetables on a small cutting board. The rhythmic thud of the knife, a small, solid sound in the chaos of the storm. The propane lamp cast a warm, flickering glow inside the cabin, a tiny island of light in an ocean of darkness and fury. That's when I saw it. Rule 84. Sometimes, in the rain, you will see a face in the glass, looking in. It will not have eyes. It was in my peripheral vision at first. A pale smudge against the rain-streaked glass, a trick of the light. But it didn't go away. I forced myself to keep chopping. Thud. Thud. Carrot, celery, onion, normal things. I am a normal person doing a normal thing. Do not scream. Do not react. I slowly, deliberately finished chopping the onion and placed the knife down on the cutting board. I did not turn my head. I looked straight ahead, at the cupboard in front of me, but I could still see the shape in the corner of my eye. It was a face. A human face, pressed against the glass, 10 feet from where I stood. It was pale, unnaturally smooth, and where its eyes should have been, there was only blank, unblemished skin. Its mouth was slightly open, as if in a state of placid surprise. The rain streamed down the glass over it, making it look like it was weeping. My breath hitched. A cold, paralyzing terror seized me. It was one thing to hear a voice from the darkness below. It was another to have something right here, outside my window, watching me. 100 feet up in the air, in the middle of a raging thunderstorm. It is only a reflection of your own fear. It feeds on acknowledgement. I fought every instinct in my body. The urge to scream, to run, to grab the heavy fire extinguisher and smash the thing against the glass. But the rule was clear. Reaction was a form of nourishment. Acknowledgement was an invitation. So I did the hardest thing I could imagine. I turned my back to it. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I walked on trembling legs to the small stove, my back to the window where the eyeless face was watching. I lit the burner, my hand shaking so badly it took 3 tries. I poured the vegetables into the pan. The sizzle was deafening in the charged silence of the cabin. I stirred them. I focused on the task, on the smell of the onions cooking, on the feel of the wooden spoon in my hand. Anything to anchor me to reality. I could feel its presence behind me. I could feel its non-gaze on my back. Was it just a reflection? A hallucination? Or was there truly a creature clinging to the outside of my tower, 100 feet from the ground, waiting patiently for me to look at it? I didn't know which was worse. I did not turn around. I cooked my meal. I ate it, forcing the food down my tight throat, each bite tasting of ash and fear. I cleaned my plate. I prepared my cot for bed. All the while the storm raged, and I refused to look at the window. I refused to give it the satisfaction. I could feel it there for at least an hour. A patient, silent, eyeless presence. Then, as abruptly as it appeared, the feeling was gone. The pressure on the back of my neck lifted. I waited another 30 minutes before I dared to risk a glance. I turned slowly. The window was empty, showing only the rain and the occasional blinding flash of lightning. It was gone. It had faded. I had passed the test. The relief was so intense it left me weak. I collapsed onto my cot, the adrenaline leaving me shaky and nauseous. I had survived another night, another rule. But the victory felt hollow. I wasn't winning. I was just surviving, for now. The forest was testing me, yes, but it also felt like it was teaching me. And I was terrified of the lessons to come. As the storm began to subside, replaced by a steady, drumming rain, I lay in the darkness, listening. And just as I was about to drift into a shallow, uneasy sleep, I heard a new sound. It came from the woods, far below, but it was unnervingly clear. It was a voice, a man's voice, weak and filled with pain. "Help me," it cried. "Please, somebody help me." I froze, every muscle tensing. It wasn't the voice of a stranger. I knew it intimately. It was my own. The voice, my voice, cried out again, a perfect echo of my own timbre, laced with a convincing tremor of pain. "I've fallen. I think my leg is broken. Rule Phase 6. If you hear your own voice calling for help from the woods, it is not you. It is learning. Stay inside." The last two words of that rule were the most terrifying. It is learning. Sarah's voice had been a weaponized memory, something pulled from my past. But this was different. This was mimicry. It implied observation. The thing in the forest hadn't just rifled through my psyche. It had listened to me. Perhaps it heard me muttering to myself, or testing the radio, or cursing as I stubbed my toe. It had recorded the sound of me, and now it was playing it back as a lure. I lay frozen on my cot, every muscle locked. To hear your own voice begging for help is a profoundly disorienting experience. It bypasses reason and strikes at a primal instinct for self-preservation. My mind knew it was a trick, a phantom. The rules had warned me, but my body reacted against my will. My heart hammered, my muscles tensed as if preparing to run towards the sound. It was a biological imperative to save oneself, twisted into a psychological weapon. "Please." My voice pleaded from the darkness below. Closer this time, as if it were at the base of the tower's steel legs. "I'm bleeding. It's so cold." I pressed the heels of my palms into my eye sockets, trying to crush the sound out of existence. The thing wasn't just mimicking my voice, it was mimicking my fear. It knew what a person in distress would say. It was improvising. The learning was happening in real time. What would it learn next? Would it start whispering my private thoughts? Would it call out the name of my father? His voice weak and sick, just as I remembered it from the hospital. The voice continued its desperate monologue for nearly an hour. It described the supposed injury in gruesome detail. It begged for water. It whimpered. Each word was a perfect copy of my own vocal patterns. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just lay there, a prisoner in my glass cage, listening to myself die in the woods below. It was a new kind of torture, more intimate and violating than the eyeless face or the spectral fire. This was an attack on my very identity. The sun, when it finally arrived, felt less like a reprieve and more like an intermission. The terror didn't vanish, it just retreated into the shadows, waiting for its next cue. I rose from the cot feeling like an old man, my joints aching, my mind afraid not of paranoia and exhaustion. I performed my morning duties in a haze. Scan the horizon, log the weather, check the radio. The mundane routine was the only thing keeping me from screaming. The forest looked peaceful, almost mocking in its serenity. The trees stood silent, holding their secrets. Was it one entity, or many? Was the eyeless face the same thing that mimicked my voice? Or was this forest a crowded metropolis of horrors, each with its own territory and hunting methods? The laminated list was my only guide, a crude map of a hostile country. My eyes fell on the calendar I had tacked to the wall. I had been marking off the days, a ritual to maintain my sanity. I counted the excess. It had been almost a month. My gaze drifted to the lunar cycle printed at the bottom of the page. My blood went cold. Tonight was the new moon. Rule Feint 7, once a month on the new moon. Leave a portion of your rations on the platform outside the hatch. A can of meat, some salted crackers. It must be salted. Do not watch to see what takes it. In the morning it will be gone. This is a payment. Do not miss a payment. A payment. The word implied a transaction, a contract. I wasn't just a lookout, I was a tenant. And the rent was due. The rule was specific. A can of meat. Salted crackers. The salt seemed important. In folklore, salt was a ward against evil, a symbol of purity. But here, it was a seasoning for a monster's dinner. The day crawled by. Each tick of the clock a countdown to the ritual I would have to perform. The fear was different now. It wasn't the reactive terror of a sudden event. It was the slow, grinding dread of anticipation. I had to willingly participate. I had to open the hatch after dark, the one thing I had been conditioned to never, ever do. I selected the items from my meager pantry: a can of corned beef hash, a sleeve of saltine crackers. I held them in my hands. They felt impossibly heavy, like a king's tribute to a dragon. This was my offering. My payment. What was I paying for? Another month of life? Or was I just buying another month of torment? The final line of the rule echoed in my mind. Do not miss a payment. The implication was clear. Missing a payment would be worse than anything I had yet experienced. As sunset approached, I felt a new level of anxiety. The sky was clear tonight. No storm to hide behind. Just a vast, star-filled emptiness. I locked the hatch at the prescribed time. The heavy thump and click of the bolt doing little to soothe my nerves. I knew that in a few hours I would have to undo it. I ate my own dinner. A tasteless bowl of rice and beans. My stomach churning. I tried to read, but the words were a meaningless jumble. All I could think about was the platform, just outside my door, on the other side of the hatch. The offering plate. The hours passed in agonizing slowness. I waited until I was sure it was deep into the night. According to my watch, it was 1 a.m. The forest was silent. No voices, no tapping, no singing. It was as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath, waiting. It was time. My hands were slick with sweat. I took the can of hash and the crackers and placed them by the hatch. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. "You can do this, Alex," I whispered, and the sound of my own voice, my real voice, was a small comfort. I reached for the bolt. It felt ice cold to the touch. Sliding it back was the loudest sound I had ever heard. A deafening shriek of metal on metal that seemed to echo across the entire forest. I paused, listening. Nothing. With trembling hands, I lifted the heavy steel hatch. It opened onto the catwalk, revealing a square of night sky, glittering with a billion indifferent stars. The cold mountain air rushed in, smelling of pine and damp earth, and of something else. A faint, musky odor, like a wet animal and rich soil. Do not watch to see what takes it. This was the hardest part. I had to place the food outside, into the darkness. and trust that the rule was absolute. The urge to peer over the edge, to shine my flashlight down the stairs, to see what I was feeding, was almost overwhelming. My curiosity was a physical itch, a burning need to know. But the memory of the eyeless face, of the violet fire, of my own voice begging for help, held me back. Knowledge, in this place, was a poison. I knelt, keeping my eyes fixed on the interior of the cabin. I reached out, my arm plunging into the cold night air, and placed the can and the crackers on the steel grating of the catwalk, just outside the opening. My fingers brushed against the cold metal, and I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned. I pulled the hatch closed immediately. It landed with a deep, final boom that shook the floor. I didn't wait. I slammed the bolt home, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I scrambled back from the hatch, my back hitting the far wall of the cabin. And then I listened. For a long time, there was only silence. The wind sighed around the tower. I began to think that maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe the rule was just another part of the psychological warfare. Then I heard it. It wasn't a footstep. It wasn't the sound of an animal sniffing or chewing. It was a wet, dragging sound from below, a sound of something heavy and soft being pulled up the steel stairs. Shlump, shlump, shlump. It was slow, laborious, and it was getting closer. I huddled against the wall, making myself as small as possible, my eyes screwed shut. The dragging sound stopped right below the hatch. There was a long, drawn-out silence. I could hear my own blood roaring in my ears. Then, a soft, delicate tink sound. The sound of something tapping the can of meat. It was followed by a low, guttural noise, a wet, satisfied, sounding exhalation that seemed to vibrate through the floor. It wasn't the sound of any animal I had ever heard. A moment later, I heard a dry, cracking sound. The crackers, the sound was methodical, unhurried. It was eating. The thing I was paying rent to was just outside my door, having its monthly meal. I stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The image of the eyeless face pressed against the glass flashed in my mind. Was it the same creature? Was that what I was feeding? The feeding sounds continued for about 5 minutes. Then they stopped. I heard the wet, dragging sound again, moving away from the hatch, descending the stairs. Schlump, schlump, low schlump. It faded back into the silence of the forest. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I sat there on the floor, my back against the wall, until the sun came up. I had survived. I had made the payment. When the sky was a safe, bright blue, I forced myself to approach the hatch. I unbolted it and lifted it, squinting in the morning light. The catwalk was empty. The can and the cracker sleeve were gone. There was no trace of them ever having been there. Except for one thing. On the cold steel of the platform, right where I had left the food, was a single, long, black feather. It was nearly 2 feet long, impossibly dark, and it seemed to drink the light around it. It wasn't from any bird I could identify. As I reached down to touch it, it dissolved into a puff of fine, gray ash that the morning breeze immediately carried away. The payment had been accepted, but the receipt it left behind told me that my landlord was something far stranger and older than I could ever have imagined. The week following the new moon payment was a profound and unsettling silence. The forest seemed to be sleeping, or perhaps digesting. There were no voices on the wind, no taps on the hatch, no unnatural fires painting the horizon. The quiet should have been a relief, a return to the tranquility I had originally sought. Instead, it was the most unnerving period yet. It was the silence of a predator lying in wait, the tense stillness before a pounce. The horrors were no longer just happening to me, I was now part of the system. I had paid my rent. I had a place in this terrible ecosystem, and the knowledge of that complicity was a heavier burden than any sudden fright. My days were spent in a state of obsessive vigilance. I abandoned the novels I had brought with me. My only reading material was the laminated list of rules. I studied it for hours, the frantic handwriting now as familiar as my own. I analyzed every word, every turn of phrase, searching for hidden meanings, for loopholes. Were these rules designed to keep me alive? Or were they merely a set of instructions for how to be a better victim, how to prolong the game for my tormentors? The feather, or the memory of it, haunted me. It wasn't a thing of this world. It was a receipt, a token of a transaction I didn't understand. What kind of creature had feathers that dissolved into ash? What kind of landlord required payment in salted meat? The questions circled in my mind. A flock of vultures over a dying animal. I started a new logbook, separate from the official one. In it, I documented everything: the sounds, the sights, the feelings. I wrote down my theories about the eyeless face, the mimic, the thing that dragged itself up the stairs. I drew a crude map of the area, marking the location of the violet fire. The journal became my new religion, my only confidant. Writing it all down felt like an act of defiance, a way of asserting my own reality against the one the forest was trying to impose on me. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the payment, I was cleaning the cabin, a desperate attempt to impose some order on my fragmenting world. I was wiping down the inside of the food locker, the same place I had first found the list. As my cloth passed over the metal door, I felt a strange texture beneath it. I stopped, looking closer. There, etched into the steel as if by acid, were words. Faint, spidery, and not part of the original manufacturing. They were names: Thomas Albright, 1978, Eleanor Vance, 1982, Samuel Pike, 1991, David Chen, 2004, Rachel Weisz, 2016. A list of my predecessors, a list of the people who had written the rules, who had made the payments, who had listened to the voices. Where were they now? Had they served their 6 months and escaped? Or were their names on this door, because this tower was their tombstone? The last name, Rachel Weisz, from 2016, sent a particular chill down my spine. The handwriting on the laminated list was frantic, shifting. Was it one person's descent into madness? Or was it the combined effort of all these people, each one adding a new rule, as the forest revealed a new horror? Had Rachel Weisz written the rule about your own voice calling from the woods? Had Samuel Pike been the first to see the eyeless face? The discovery of the names broke the dam of my composure. I was not the first. I was just the latest in a long, tragic line. The solitude I had craved was a lie. This tower was crowded with ghosts. That night, something changed. I was sitting at the desk, staring at the list under the glow of my propane lamp. I knew its 7 rules by heart. I could recite them in my sleep. But as I stared at the yellowed, laminated paper, I thought I saw a flicker, a trick of the light. I blinked, rubbing my tired eyes. I looked again. It was not a trick. Below the 7th rule, new words were appearing. They weren't being written. They were bleeding into existence. The ink appearing on the paper from nowhere, a dark stain spreading slowly, forming letters. I watched, my breath caught in my throat, my blood turning to ice as the 8th rule materialized. 8. If the radio whispers your name when it's off, answer it. Tell it one true secret. A lie will cost you your tongue. I recoiled from the desk as if the list were radioactive. This was impossible. The paper was laminated. Nothing could get in or out. But the rule was there, as clear and undeniable as the others, written in the same spidery, desperate hand. The list was alive. It was a living document, updating itself as the forest devised new torments. A lie will cost you your tongue. The specificity of the punishment was what terrified me most. It wasn't vague like, "There are no second chances." It was a direct, physical threat, a promise of mutilation. For the next 3 days I lived in fear of the radio. The large, old-fashioned console sat on the desk like a dormant beast. It was my only official link to the outside world, to Mr. Henderson and the Park Service. I had to use it for my morning and evening check-ins. Every time I touched the power switch, my hand trembled. I kept my reports brief, my voice a strained monotone, terrified that any stray word, any hint of emotion, might be considered a secret. On the third night, it happened. I was reading my journal, trying to find some pattern in the chaos. The radio was off. The power switch was down. The cabin was silent save for the gentle sighing of the wind, and then a crackle of static, soft but unmistakable. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. The static crackled again, and then a voice breathed from the speaker. It was a dry, sibilant whisper, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Alex." My heart stopped. It was here, the moment from the new rule. The radio was off. It had no power, but it was speaking. I stared at it, my mind a blank wall of panic. I wanted to smash it, to tear its wires out, to throw it from the top of the tower. But the rule was absolute. "Answer it, Alex." The whisper came again, more insistent this time. "Tell me a secret." My throat was as dry as dust. A secret? A true secret. My mind raced. What could I tell it? My life was an open book of failures. My failed engagement with Sarah. The thing that mimicked her voice already knew about that. My professional disappointments. Too shallow. It had to be something real. Something that carried weight. Something that would satisfy a thing that could make ink bleed through plastic. A lie will cost you your tongue. I thought of my father. I thought of his last days in the sterile, white hospital room. The air thick with the smell of antiseptic and decay. I thought of the moment that had haunted my waking and sleeping hours ever since. The secret I had never spoken aloud, not even to myself. My hand shaking, I reached out and keyed the microphone. The button felt cold, alien. I brought it to my lips. "I'm here," I whispered, my voice hoarse. The static on the radio hissed expectantly. "My father," I began, the words tearing themselves from my throat. He was dying. The cancer had taken everything. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. The doctors said it was only a matter of days. He was on a morphine drip for the pain. I paused, taking a ragged breath. The memory was so vivid. It was like I was back in that room. The night he died. I was alone with him. The nurse had just left. He was struggling to breathe. Each breath was a rattling sound. A wet, horrible sound. He looked at me. He couldn't speak, but his eyes were begging me. He was in so much pain. He just wanted it to be over. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot against my cold skin. The morphine drip had a button. I confessed, the secret spilling out of me like poison. A button for an extra dose, for breakthrough pain. The nurse told me not to touch it. She said his heart was too weak. But he was looking at me, and he was in such agony. I choked on a sob. I pressed it. I pressed the button. I held his hand and I pressed the button twice. He stopped breathing a minute later. The doctor said his heart gave out. They said it was peaceful. But it wasn't. I killed him. I killed my own father to stop the noise he was making. I let go of the microphone button. The secret was out. Hanging in the dead air of the cabin, offered up to the thing in the radio. I felt hollowed out, utterly exposed. The radio was silent for a long moment. I waited for a voice, for a judgment, for a sign that my offering had been accepted. But it wasn't a voice that came from the speaker. It was a sound. A wet, rattling sound. The sound of a man's last, labored breath, struggling against lungs filled with fluid. It was the exact sound my father had made in his final moments. A sound I had spent a year trying to forget, now amplified, broadcast into my tiny room, as clear and as real as if he were died on a cot behind me. The sound played on a loop over and over again. Gasp. Rattle. Rattle. I screamed. I scrambled back away from the desk, my hands over my ears, but I couldn't block it out. It was inside my head. The forest didn't just know my secrets, it could play them back to me. It could make me relive my worst moments. The rattling breath finally faded, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than the noise. I was on the floor, curled into a ball, shaking uncontrollably. I had survived. I had told a true secret. I had kept my tongue. But I had lost something far more precious. A piece of my soul. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to look up, back at the desk, back at the laminated list. My eyes widened in horror. The ink was bleeding again. Slowly, inexorably. Below the 8th rule, a new line of text was beginning to form. 9. The list is complete. One name must be added so one can be removed. The tower requires a watcher. If you wish to leave, you must find another to take your place. Use the radio. Tell them about the view. I read the final rule once, then twice. The words swam, then snapped into a focus so sharp, so cruel, that it felt like a physical blow. This wasn't a survival guide. It had never been a survival guide. It was a contract, a set of terms and conditions for a job I hadn't understood I was applying for. The Watcher of Station 4. My blood ran cold. A glacial flood of understanding. The names on the door. They weren't victims, not in the way I'd thought. They were employees who had successfully tendered their resignation. Rachel Wace hadn't died here in 2016. She had found me. David Chen had found her. And so on back through the decades, a chain of desperate souls, luring the next into the trap to buy their own freedom. I scrambled to the food locker, my movements clumsy with panic. I ran my trembling fingers over the etched names. Thomas Albright, 1978. The name was gone. The metal where it had been was smooth, unblemished, as if it had never existed. One name removed. A position had opened up. My position. The job wasn't to watch for fires. The job was to be an anchor, a sacrifice. A payment of presence to whatever ancient things lived in this forest. The rules weren't to protect me from them. They were to make me a more effective, long-lasting offering. My escape from the city, from my life, was a cosmic joke. I had fled a cage of concrete and regret, only to lock myself in a much smaller one, 100 feet in the air, surrounded by a prison of trees that stretched to the horizon. My options laid themselves bare in the stark, cold light of the cabin. I could refuse. I could smash the radio, burn the list, and wait. But what would happen then? Would my name simply appear on the door? My consciousness joining the chorus of whispers and phantoms? Would I become the eyeless face, forever pressed against the glass? watching my replacement? Or would the thing that dragged itself up the stairs for its monthly payment finally come inside for a more permanent meal? Or I could accept the terms. I could become a monster to save myself. I could use the radio, the very instrument of my torture, to craft a lie. I could sing a siren song of peace and solitude, of escape and tranquility. I could find another broken person, another soul running from their life, and lead them here to take my place. I would be free, but I would never be clean. For days, I was paralyzed. I paced the small cabin like a caged animal, the 10 feet from window to window my entire world. I looked at the satellite phone, my one emergency link to the outside world. Could I call for help? Could I tell them the truth? I imagined the conversation. Hello. Yes. My name is Alex Thompson. I'm in Watchtower 4. The forest is alive, the rulebook is magic. And my dead fiancé's voice is trying to lure me outside. Please send help. They would think I'd gone mad from the isolation. And even if they believed me, even if they sent a helicopter, what then? I imagined the violet fire lashing out, or the thing with ashen feathers swatting it from the sky. The rules were absolute. There was no escape outside the system. My reflection in the dark glass showed a stranger, gaunt with a wild beard and eyes that held the haunted look of a man who had seen too much. I was no longer Alex Thompson, urban planner. I was the Watcher. The choice, when it came, was not a dramatic moment of decision. It was a quiet, cold acceptance. A simple calculation of survival. I had already killed my father to stop a sound I couldn't bear. What was one more soul to save my own? I walked to the desk. I sat down. My movements were calm, deliberate. I took my secret journal, the one where I had documented everything, and slid it into the same hiding spot as the laminated list. The next person would need it. Then, I turned on the radio. I switched the frequency from the Park Service channel to a public band, one that might be picked up by long-haul truckers, by hobbyists, by lonely people listening in the dead of night. I took the microphone in my hand. It no longer felt cold. It felt like a tool. I cleared my throat. I thought about what to say, how to craft the perfect lure. I had to sound like the man I had wanted to be when I first came here. A man who had found peace. A man who was whole. I keyed the mic. Hello, I said, my voice smooth, steady, and warm. Is anyone out there? This is a private broadcast. I'm not supposed to be doing this. But I had to tell someone. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air, creating intrigue. I'm calling from a place where the world goes quiet, up in the mountains. I took a job to get away from it all, you know. The noise, the people, the pressure. I thought it might be lonely, but it's not. It's perfect. I let a little wonder creep into my voice. The tone of a man sharing a beautiful secret. You can see the stars so clearly up here. They feel close enough to touch. And the sunsets. Every night, the sky just sets itself on fire. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I leaned closer to the mic, my voice dropping to an intimate whisper. If you're out there, if you're listening, and if you feel like you're drowning, just know that places like this still exist. Places where you can finally breathe. I stopped, my finger hovering over the button. I had laid the bait. Now for the hook. My term is almost up. I lied, the falsehood sliding from my tongue with terrifying ease. They'll be looking for a replacement soon. I don't know. I just felt like someone out there needed to hear this. I let go of the button. The broadcast was out there, a seed of deception planted in the ether. Now, I just had to wait for a desperate soul to take root. I looked out the window, at the endless sea of trees stretching out under the moonlight. The view was magnificent. It was a sight to die for, and I knew, with a certainty that settled in my bones, like the deepest winter cold, that someone would. My name is Jack Peterson. By trade and temperament, I am a historian. My life has been one of quiet archives and dusty books, a methodical search for narrative threads in the tangled mess of the past. I find comfort in facts, in primary sources, in the logical progression of cause and effect. But the past year had been difficult. A cascade of personal losses that left my own timeline feeling fractured and unreliable. I needed an escape, not just to a new place, but from the noise of my own life. I craved silence. A profound, crushing, absolute silence that might allow me to piece myself back together. That's what led me to the Gila National Forest, to a seasonal job as a fire lookout. It promised little more than solitude and a paycheck, an opportunity to be a hermit with a purpose. The tower, perched on a lonely peak 5 miles from the nearest dirt road, was a steel and glass room immaculately designed to attract lightning and offer a 360-degree view of 20,000 square miles of southern New Mexico. The ranger who drove me, the last leg of the journey, was a man of few words. His face weathered into a permanent squint. He helped me haul my personal gear and a box of supplies up the 65 steps to the 15x 15-foot cabin. He pointed out the propane fridge, the wood, burning stove, and the Osborne fire finder that dominated the center of the room. Before he left, he handed me a single, laminated card, its edges softened with age. "Read this," he said, his tone flat and unreadable. "Everything you need to know is on there." And then he was gone. The rumble of his truck faded, and the silence I had so desperately sought descended like a physical weight. It was vast, ancient, and complete. Alone in my glass cage on top of the world, I looked down at the card in my hand. It was a simple list, typed on an old machine, the letters slightly uneven. These were my instructions, the rules for my new, isolated existence. The instructions read: 1. Log all weather observations at 0800 and 1500 precisely. 2. Scan the viewshed every 20 minutes without fail. Log all scans. 3. Report all confirmed smoke columns to dispatch immediately. Do not speculate on the cause. 4. If you hear your name whispered on the wind, do not answer. It is a trick of the acoustics. 5. At night, keep the cabin lamp on. It dislikes the dark more than you do. 6. You may sometimes see a man watching from the tree line at dusk. Do not acknowledge him. He is not there for you. 7. If the radio transmits a lullaby between 0300 and 0400, turn the device off and do not turn it on again until sunrise. 8. Never, under any circumstances, leave the catwalk after the sun has set. My first reaction was one of academic curiosity, mixed with skepticism. The first 3 rules were standard operating procedure, duties I had been trained on and expected to perform. They were the foundation of the job, the mundane reality that grounded this strange existence. They lent a veneer of credibility to the rest. The others were unsettling. My rational mind, the historian trained to seek primary sources and logical explanations, immediately began to deconstruct them. Rule why for I, a simple, almost poetic, explanation for auditory pareidolia. A common phenomenon in places of profound silence where the wind can play tricks on the ear. A sensible warning against letting the isolation prey on one's mind. But the others were harder to dismiss. Rule 85 personified an unknown, it attributing to it a primal fear of the dark. The language was specific and strange. It implied a presence, a consciousness that shared this space with me. Rule Phase 6 was even more direct, introducing a human-like figure, but framing its presence as something to be ignored. He is not there for you. The phrasing was chillingly ambiguous. If not for me, then for what? Or for whom? Rule 57 was pure, unadulterated strangeness. A lullaby on a VHF frequency reserved for emergency communications. It defied all logic. A bizarre event that could not be explained away by weather or overwrought nerves. And Rule Fight 8 was a stark command, establishing a clear boundary. The catwalk, the narrow metal walkway that encircled the cabin, was safe territory. The world beyond it, after sunset, was not. It turned my sanctuary into a prison cell each night. I considered the possibility that it was all a prank. A long-running joke passed down through generations of lookouts to haze the newcomer. It seemed the most plausible explanation. A way to cope with the crushing loneliness by inventing a mythology for the place. I, with my intellectual arrogance, felt I was above such things. I would observe, I would document, and I would find the logical truth behind the folklore. I placed the card on the corner of my desk, a curiosity to be analyzed later, and turned my attention to the job at hand. The first few days passed in a haze of routine. I woke with the sun, made coffee, and performed my first scan of the horizon. I logged the weather at 0800 sharp, my voice sounding small and foreign as I radioed it to a disembodied dispatcher miles away. I scanned the viewshed every 20 minutes, my binoculars tracing the endless ridges and valleys. I wrote in my personal journal. I tried to untangle the knots in my own mind. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of the tower in the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. It was exactly the peace I had sought. But as the sun began its slow descent on the third day, a quiet unease began to settle over me. The forest, so vibrant and alive in the daylight, transformed into a place of deep shadows and hidden spaces. The familiar became uncanny, distorted by the fading light. I remembered the rules, and the feeling of being the subject of a prank began to fade, replaced by a cold knot of apprehension in my stomach. I was on the catwalk, performing my final scan before the sun, completely below the western peaks. The sky was a riot of orange and purple. The air was still. I swept my binoculars from north to east, the familiar landscape rolling past my lenses. Then I turned south, towards a distant clearing about 2 miles away, a pale scar in the dark green blanket of the forest. And I saw him. He was standing at the far edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the tree line. A dark, upright shape. A man. My first instinct was a jolt of relief. Another person. A hiker, perhaps, or a hunter making his way home. I kept the binoculars trained on him, waiting for movement. A wave, a step, anything. There was nothing. he was perfectly still. Not the stillness of a patient hunter, but a profound, unnatural immobility, like a statue carved from shadow. Rule Phase 6 echoed in my mind. Do not acknowledge him. He is not there for you. My heart began to pound, a frantic drum against the silence of the evening. My training, my entire intellectual being, screamed at me to observe, to gather data, to understand. I wanted to keep watching, to wait for him to reveal his purpose. But the laminated card on my desk felt like a talisman of a different kind of knowledge, an older and more frightening wisdom. My hands were shaking. I lowered the binoculars, breaking the visual connection. I forced myself to turn away, my back to the clearing and the silent figure within it. I took a deep, shuddering breath and walked back into the cabin, the metal of the catwalk ringing, unnaturally loud under my feet. I slid the door shut and bolted it. I went to the logbook. My hand, when I picked up the pen, was slick with sweat. For the 1840 scan, I wrote a single word: clear. It felt like a lie. It felt like a betrayal of my own senses. But it also felt like an act of survival. I did not look south again that night. I turned on the cabin's main lamp, its yellow glow pushing back the encroaching darkness, a small island of light in an ocean of black. But I could not shake the feeling. A cold, prickling certainty that has not left me since. The feeling of being watched. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every creak of the tower, every sigh of the wind against the glass was magnified into a potential threat. The single lamp I kept on, as per Rule 25, cast long, dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes. My mind, the trained historian's mind, that prided itself on logic and evidence, was at war with a more primal part of my brain, a part that understood the simple, terrifying language of being prey. I replayed the sighting of the man over and over. He was too far away to be an immediate threat, yet his stillness was more menacing than any aggressive posture. It was the stillness of something that had no need to hurry, something that had all the time in the world. I tried to rationalize it. A hunter waiting for game, a hiker taking a long rest, a trick of the light, a strangely shaped tree stump that my isolated mind had anthropomorphized. But none of the explanations felt right. They were flimsy shields against a certainty that had taken root in my gut. The rule existed for a reason. Do not acknowledge him. He is not there for you. The words implied a known phenomenon, a recurring event that previous lookouts had encountered and for which a protocol had been established. This wasn't a prank. It was a warning. The next week was a study in forced normalcy. I performed my duties with a brittle, almost fanatical precision. I logged the weather at 0800 and 1500, my voice tight and controlled over the radio. I scanned the viewshed every 20 minutes, my gaze deliberately avoiding the southern clearing. I forced myself to read, to write, to engage in the mundane tasks of survival. Cooking, cleaning, chopping wood. But the silence I had once craved had become an accomplice to my fear. It was no longer peaceful, it was watchful. The isolation, once a balm, was now a cage, amplifying every internal tremor of anxiety. I found myself talking to myself, my own voice a desperate attempt to fill the void. to prove I was still here, still sane. I developed a new, nervous habit. Checking the laminated card. My fingers would trace the typed letters of the rules, as if they were a rosary, each one a bead of terrible prayer. The rules were my only anchor in this sea of unease. The only thing that offered a semblance of control in a situation that felt utterly out of my control. I was no longer a historian observing folklore. I was a believer clinging to scripture. It was on the 10th night that the second shoe dropped. I had fallen into a shallow, restless sleep. The kind where you are aware of every sound, every shift in the atmosphere. The wind had picked up. A low moan that seemed to carry whispers I couldn't quite decipher. I told myself it was just the acoustics, just Rule 5-4 playing out. Do not answer. I pulled the thin blanket tighter around my shoulders and squeezed my eyes shut. Then, a new sound cut through the wind. A crackle of static from the VHF radio on the desk. My eyes snapped open. The radio was for official use only. Dispatch, other lookouts, fire crews on the ground. It was never, ever active in the dead of night, unless there was a major emergency. I sat up, my heart instantly hammering against my ribs. I glanced at my watch. The glowing hands read 3:17 a.m. The static cleared. And then a sound so clear, so out of place, so utterly impossible, filled the small cabin. It was music, a lullaby. A simple, tinkling melody played on what sounded like an old music box. It was gentle, sweet, and the most terrifying thing I had ever heard. Rule 5-7 screamed in my head, a klaxon of pure panic. If the radio transmits a lullaby between 0300 and 0400, turn the device off and do not turn it on again until sunrise. My body was frozen. Every instinct told me to stay in the relative safety of my cot, to pull the blanket over my head and pretend it wasn't happening. But the rule was a command, not a suggestion. It implied that listening, that allowing the sound to continue, was the greater danger. The music box melody continued its serene, horrifying loop. A sound of childhood innocence, corrupted into something monstrous. With a surge of adrenaline that felt like ice water in my veins, I threw off the blanket. The floor was cold against my bare feet. I moved toward the desk. My eyes locked on the radio, as if it were a venomous snake. The lullaby seemed to grow louder, more insistent, each note a tiny, sharp needle against my sanity. My hand trembled as I reached for the power knob. For a terrifying second, my fingers wouldn't obey. The music was hypnotic, pulling at some forgotten corner of my mind, a memory of a safety that felt like a lie. I forced my fingers to close around the knob. I twisted it hard to the left. Click. The music stopped. The silence that rushed back in was somehow worse. It was heavy, expectant, and felt profoundly wrong. I stood there in the dark, panting, my body drenched in a cold sweat. I did not turn the radio back on. I backed away from the desk slowly, as if retreating from a wild animal, and scrambled back into my cot. I didn't sleep again. I just lay there, wide-eyed and shaking, waiting for the sun. Sunrise was a reprieve, but not a cure. The daylight pushed back the immediate, visceral terror, but it couldn't erase the memory. The historian in me tried to reassert control. It had to be a crossed signal. a freak atmospheric event, a prankster with a powerful transmitter. But the specificity of the rule, the precise time, the nature of the sound, it all pointed to something else, something known, something anticipated. I spent the day in a fog of exhaustion and fear. My hands shook so badly, I could barely write in the logbook. My routine scans of the horizon were no longer about looking for smoke. They were about looking for threats. My binoculars felt less like a tool and more like a liability, a way of bringing the frightening distance into sharp, terrifying focus. As dusk began to fall, a cold dread coiled in my stomach. I knew I had to do the final scan, but I was terrified of what I might see. I forced myself out onto the catwalk, the wind cold against my face. I raised the binoculars, my movement stiff and jerky. I scanned north. Clear. East. Clear. West. Clear. My hands hesitated. I didn't want to look south. I didn't want to see the clearing. But not looking felt like cowardice, like letting the fear win completely. Taking a shaky breath, I turned the binoculars south, and my blood ran cold. He was there. Not in the distant clearing at the edge of the tree line. He was closer. He was standing in a smaller clearing, maybe only a mile away, at the base of the ridge my tower stood upon. He was still just a dark, upright shape, but he was undeniably, terrifyingly closer. And this time, something was different. His posture. Before, he had been facing the tree line. Now he was turned slightly, angled directly towards the tower. Towards me. He was watching me watch him. Rule Phase 6. Do not acknowledge him. My mind was screaming. It was a physical effort to keep my body from reacting, from dropping the binoculars, from shouting, from running. I was paralyzed, caught in his silent, motionless gaze. The laminated card on my desk offered the only path to survival, a single, impossible instruction. I had to pretend he wasn't there, but he was, and he knew I could see him. Lowering the binoculars was an act of pure will, a severing of a connection that felt physical, like tearing my own eyes away from a gruesome spectacle. I stumbled back from the railing of the catwalk, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He was closer, a mile away, and he was looking at me. The pretense that I was merely observing him was gone. We were now participants in a silent, terrifying exchange. I scrambled back inside the cabin, slamming the door and throwing the bolt with a loud, metallic clank that did nothing to make me feel safe. The cabin, once my sanctuary, now felt like a glass cage, exposing me on all sides. My mind, the orderly fact-based mind of a historian, was shattering. The world I had understood, a world governed by logic and explainable phenomena, was dissolving into a nightmare, landscape of impossible rules and silent, watching men. The next few days were a descent into a new kind of madness, one born of vigilance and profound isolation. I performed my duties on autopilot, a ghost haunting the machinery of my own life. My entries in the logbook became terse, almost illegible scrawls. My radio calls to dispatch were clipped, my voice a stranger's. I stopped reading. The words on the page were meaningless compared to the terrifying text of my reality. My personal journal, once a place for academic musings and self-reflection, became a frantic testament to my unraveling sanity. I wrote about the man, the lullaby, the crushing certainty that I was being hunted. The entries were not for posterity. They were a desperate attempt to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining it all. I avoided the southern windows. I would scan the other 3 quadrants with meticulous care, but when it came time to turn south, I would freeze, my body refusing the command. The fear of seeing him again, perhaps even closer, was a physical barrier. But not looking was its own form of torture. The unknown was a vacuum that my imagination rushed to fill with horrors, far worse than what my eyes might confirm. Was he still there? Had he moved? Was he, at this very moment, beginning the slow walk up the ridge? On the 4th day after the last sighting, the wind changed. It had been calm for over a week, the air still and heavy. Now, a strong, steady gale began to blow from the west, making the tower groan and sway like the mast of a ship in a storm. The sound was a constant, low moan, a mournful cry that seeped through the glass and into my bones. I was on the catwalk in the late afternoon, leaning into the wind, my jacket pulled tight. The sky was a canvas of bruised-looking clouds. I was forcing myself through a scan, my eyes watering from the wind, when I heard it. It was faint, woven into the fabric of the wind's howl, but it was unmistakable. A whisper. "Jack." I froze, my blood turning to ice. It was my name. Not shouted, but drawn out, a sibilant thread of sound carried on the gale. I snapped my head around, searching the empty landscape. There was nothing. Just endless trees swaying violently in the wind. Rule Fe 4. If you hear your name whispered on the wind, do not answer. It is a trick of the acoustics. A trick of the acoustics. The rational explanation felt like a flimsy shield, a child's blanket against a monster. The sound had been too clear, too personal. It wasn't just the wind, it was a voice, shaped and directed. I clamped my hands over my ears, a primitive, useless gesture. I could still feel the vibration of it in my chest. I scrambled back inside the cabin, my heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm. The prank theory was now a distant, laughable memory. This was a script, and I was being forced to play my part. That night, the terror reached a new, suffocating peak. The wind howled relentlessly, and with every gust, I imagined my name being whispered just outside the glass. I huddled on my cot, my eyes fixed on the single propane lamp in the center of the room. It was my only defense against the encroaching darkness, my only adherence to Rule Fe 5. At night, keep the cabin lamp on. It dislikes the dark more than you do. Who or what was the man? The source of the lullaby? Or something else entirely? Something that had remained hidden, waiting for the light to fail. As if summoned by my thoughts, the lamp sputtered. The steady yellow flame shrank, trembled, and dimmed to a weak, pale orange. The shadows in the room, once held at bay, lunged inward, growing into monstrous, distorted shapes. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the lamp, my entire world shrinking to that fragile point of light. After a few agonizing seconds, it flared back to life, pushing the shadows back to the corners. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my fear. The propane. I hadn't checked the tank in days. I scrambled over to the small propane refrigerator, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the valve on the tank that fed both appliances. It was lighter than it should be. Dangerously light. I had been burning the lamp from dusk until dawn, a profligate waste of a finite resource. Now, I was faced with an impossible choice. Follow Rule Fein 5 and risk the fuel, running out completely, plunging me into total darkness. Or conserve the fuel and face whatever it was that disliked the dark. The lamp flickered again, and this time a low hiss accompanied it. It was starving. I spent the rest of the night in a state of suspended terror, watching the lamp, praying it would last until sunrise. Every flicker made my heart leap into my throat. Every groan of the tower in the wind was the sound of something testing the walls. The sun rose, but it brought no relief. Only a temporary stay of execution. The day was a blur of exhaustion and dread. I knew what I had to do. I had to go outside, down the 65 steps, to the storage shed at the base of the tower, where the spare propane tanks were kept. It was a simple task, one I had done before. But now, the thought of leaving the relative safety of the cabin, of descending to the ground, was terrifying. The man had been at the base of the ridge. The whispers had been on the wind. The ground was their territory. The tower was mine. But I had no choice. As dusk approached, painting the sky in apocalyptic shades of red and orange, I knew I couldn't face another night with a dying lamp. Taking a deep breath, I unbolted the door and stepped out onto the catwalk. The wind was still strong. I forced myself not to look south. I kept my eyes fixed on the metal stairs descending before me. One step at a time. The wind tugged at me, trying to push me off balance. My hand was slick with sweat on the cold metal railing. 65 steps had never felt so long. I reached the bottom, my feet touching the solid earth with a jolt. The storage shed was only 20 feet away. I ran to it, my boots crunching on the gravel, the sound deafeningly loud. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers clumsy and numb. I swung the door open, grabbed the first full tank I could reach, and turned to go back. And I saw him. He wasn't in the clearing a mile away. He wasn't at the tree line. He was standing at the edge of the small clearing that surrounded my tower, no more than 50 yards away. A black silhouette against the blood-red sunset. He was just standing there, perfectly still, watching me. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat, a solid knot of terror. I couldn't move. I was pinned by his presence, a specimen under glass. Rule Fein 6. Do not acknowledge him. I had to pretend he wasn't there. But he was. He was right there. My survival instinct finally broke through the paralysis. I hoisted the heavy tank, and, without looking back, I walked, as calmly as I could, back to the stairs. Every step was an agony of restraint. I wanted to run, to scream, to look over my shoulder. But I didn't. I just kept walking, focusing on the first step. I began to climb. The propane tank was heavy and awkward, banging against the metal stairs with each step. Up, away from him. I was halfway up, my lungs burning, when I heard a new sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a whisper. It was a soft, rhythmic scraping. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was coming from below me, from the steel legs of the tower itself. My blood ran cold. I stopped, clinging to the railing, and forced myself to look down. In the deep twilight shadows at the base of the tower, a second dark shape was moving. It was hunched over, its limbs long and spidery, and it was slowly, patiently beginning to climb. For a long second, my mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. The world narrowed to 2 points of impossible horror. The silent, motionless man at the tree line, the watcher, and this new thing, this spidery, hunched creature, the climber, making its slow, rhythmic way up the steel lattice of my tower. The scraping sound was the noise of its limbs, hard and sharp, finding purchase on the metal beams. It wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. Its patience was a declaration of its power. The paralysis broke. A surge of pure, animal terror flooded my system, overriding every rational thought. I turned and fled up the remaining stairs, my body screaming with effort. The heavy propane tank, which had been a burden, was now a dead weight threatening to pull me backward into the abyss. I heaved it upward, step by agonizing step, the metal canister banging against the railing, a frantic, desperate drumbeat against the steady, methodical scrape. Scrape, scrape from below. I didn't dare look down again. I fixed my eyes on the door to the cabin, the only sanctuary in a world that had turned into a predator's hunting ground. My lungs burned. My muscles screamed. The scraping grew louder, closer. It was gaining on me. I could feel the vibrations through the soles of my boots, a low hum that resonated with the frantic hammering of my own heart. I reached the catwalk, threw the propane tank onto the metal, grating with a deafening clang, and lunged for the door. My fumbling hands found the handle. I yanked it open, stumbled inside, and slammed it shut behind me. I threw the heavy deadbolt, the sound of final, definitive note of separation. I was inside. It was outside. I scrambled away from the door, my back hitting the far wall of the cabin, and slid down to the floor, my chest heaving. I was safe. For a moment, the adrenaline and relief were so overwhelming that I felt dizzy. Then, a shadow fell across the windows on the eastern side of the cabin. Slowly, I lifted my head. A shape was rising into view, blotting out the last of the twilight. It was the climber. It had reached the catwalk. It moved with a disjointed, unnatural grace, its long limbs unfolding as it straightened up. It was tall, impossibly thin, a silhouette of stretched and broken anatomy against the dying light. It had no discernible features, just a smooth, dark head that tilted with a bird, like curiosity as it regarded the cabin. It began to circle, its movements silent now that it was on the flat grating of the catwalk. Its shadow passed over each window in succession, a slow, deliberate patrol. It was inspecting its cage. My mind, finally catching up to the terror, began to race. The rules. The laminated card was still on my desk, a holy text in this new, terrifying religion. I crawled over to it, my eyes never leaving the circling shadow. I snatched it up, my fingers tracing, the words as if they could offer a physical shield. Rule A80: never, under any circumstances, leave the catwalk after the sun has set. I had broken it. I had gone down the stairs. down to the ground, to the shed. I had left the designated safe zone after the boundary of sunset had been established, and in that moment, a horrifying clarity descended upon me. This wasn't a list of suggestions or folklore. It was a treaty, a set of terms I had unknowingly agreed to by accepting this post. The first rules were my duties, my side of the bargain. The last 5 were the terms of the other party. The watcher, the silent man at the tree line, wasn't a threat. He was an observer, a sentry ensuring the treaty was upheld. And the climber was the consequence of a breach. It was the enforcer. My gaze fell on Rule .55 at night: keep the cabin lamp on. It dislikes the dark more than you do. The lamp. The new propane tank. With a surge of desperate purpose, I scrambled to my feet. The climber was at the door now. I could hear a faint, inquisitive scratching at the wood. I ignored it, my focus entirely on the lamp. I fumbled with the valve on the old, nearly empty tank, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn it. I disconnected the hose, the hiss of escaping gas sounding like a dying breath. I dragged the new, heavy tank into place, my muscles straining, and reconnected the hose. I twisted the valve, held my breath, and flicked the igniter on the lamp. A steady, brilliant yellow flame bloomed to life, pushing the oppressive shadows back to the corners of the room, filling the cabin with a warm, defiant glow. Outside, the scratching stopped. I looked up. The silhouette of the climber was framed in the window of the door. It stood perfectly still for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it recoiled from the light, melting back into the deeper shadows at the edge of the catwalk. It worked. The light was a shield. The rule was my salvation. The long night began. I didn't dare sleep. I didn't dare even sit down. I stood in the center of the room, a prisoner in my own illuminated cell, turning slowly, tracking the climber's movements as it continued its patient, endless circling of the catwalk. For hours, the only sounds were the moan of the wind and the soft, rhythmic footfalls of the creature on the metal grating outside. It never tried the door again. It never touched the glass. It just watched, waiting for the light to fail. My historian's mind, what was left of it, tried to analyze, to understand. What was this thing? A creature of the deep woods, a species unknown to science, or something else? Something older, a spirit bound to this peak, this tower, by a pact made by the first men who dared to build here. The questions were meaningless. The only truth was the light, and the shadow that paced just beyond its reach. Sometime after midnight, the wind died down. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by my own ragged breathing. The climber stopped its patrol. It stood motionless outside the south, facing window, the same direction where I had first seen the watcher. It was a dark, patient statue, its form just barely visible against the star-dusted sky. It was waiting. My own exhaustion was a physical weight. My eyes burned from staring. My body ached from standing. But fear was a potent stimulant. I watched the flame of the lamp, my new god. It was my sun, my hope, my entire universe. And then, it flickered. My heart stopped. The steady flame dipped, shrinking for a terrifying second, before flaring back to life. I stared at the tank, a cold dread washing over me. It was a new tank, yes, but how long would it last? How much fuel had I used in the preceding nights? The climber stirred. Its head tilted, as if it had heard the flicker, if it could sense the subtle shift in the quality of the light. It took a slow step toward the window. The lamp flickered again, longer this time. The flame shrank to a tiny blue nub, and the cabin was plunged into near darkness. In that instant of profound gloom, the climber lunged. A sharp, cracking sound echoed through the cabin as its hand struck the glass. The window shuddered in its frame but held. The flame sputtered back to life, weak but present, and the creature retreated again with a low hiss that sounded like tearing fabric. It was a race against the dying of the light. I looked around the cabin frantically, my mind searching for a solution. There was none. I was trapped, my fate tied to the slow consumption of a finite resource. The lamp flickered again, and again. Each time the darkness rushed in, the climber struck the glass, a little harder, a little more insistently. The window began to show a network of fine, spidery cracks emanating from the point of impact. It wouldn't hold for much longer. This was it. This was how it ended. My intellectual arrogance, my search for silence, it had all led me here. To be torn apart by a creature of shadow, in a glass box on top of the world. As the flame died down for what felt like the last time, an idea, born of pure, desperate insanity, sparked in my mind. The Osborne Fire Finder. Its base was polished metal. A reflector. In the near total darkness, I lunged for the fire finder, my hands closing around the heavy metal map disc. The climber slammed against the window again, the sound a deafening crack. I ripped the fire finder from its mount, turned and held it up just as the lamp gave one final, brilliant flare. A dying star's last gasp. I angled the polished surface, catching the burst of light and focusing it into a single, brilliant beam, aimed directly at the creature's face. A scream tore through the night. It was not human. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, a shriek of grinding metal and tearing flesh. The creature recoiled violently, stumbling back from the window, shielding its face with its long, spindly arms. It thrashed on the catwalk, its limbs flailing, and then, with a final, agonized cry, it scrambled over the railing and disappeared into the darkness below. The lamp died. The cabin was plunged into absolute blackness. I stood there, shaking, holding the useless fire fender, listening to the sound of the creature, crashing its way down the tower and into the forest below. I stood there in the dark for an eternity waiting, but it did not return. And then, slowly, miraculously, the first faint hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky. Dawn was coming. As the sun rose, painting the sky in colors of impossible beauty, I saw the Watcher one last time. He was standing in the distant southern clearing, a silent silhouette. As the first direct rays of sunlight struck the peak, he seemed to dissolve, fading into the morning mist until he was gone. I had survived. I spent the day in a state of shock, mechanically cleaning up the cabin, my movements slow and robotic. I did not log the events of the night. There were no words for them. At 0800, I picked up the radio. My voice was a hollow croak as I read the weather report to a cheerful, oblivious dispatcher. "Clear," I said, my gaze sweeping over a world that was forever changed. The silence I had sought was here, but it was no longer a comfort. It was a void, filled with the memory of scraping metal and a scream that did not belong in this world. My solitude was no longer a choice. It was a sentence. I looked at the laminated card on my desk. Its 8 rules no longer a curiosity, but the articles of my new, terrible faith. I was a historian who had stumbled upon a history that was still alive. And I was its prisoner. My name is Dr. Alastair Finch. I hold a PhD in geophysics with a specialization in seismic wave propagation and deep Earth resonance analysis. For the 7 years prior to the events I am about to document, I was employed by the United States Geological Survey, where my work was considered respectable, if not exactly groundbreaking. I am, by nature and by training, a man who believes in data, in empirical evidence, and in the fundamental, observable laws that govern our physical world. It is crucial that you understand this. The credibility of the following account rests upon the foundation of my own rationality. A foundation I now fear has been irrevocably fractured. The offer came through a third-party contractor, a faceless entity that specialized in staffing sensitive government projects. The terms were, to put it mildly, exceptional. A 6-month contract with a salary that would eclipse my annual earnings at the USGS, a significant completion bonus, and the opportunity to work with proprietary technology on what was described only as high-priority geological resonance analysis. For a man in my position, it was an irresistible proposition. My professional life had plateaued, and my personal life had recently simplified itself in the form of a quiet, amicable breakup that nonetheless left my apartment feeling cavernously empty. The prospect of a 6-month, high-intensity engagement in a remote location felt less like an exile and more like a focused, lucrative escape. I accepted the position. I submitted to a background check so thorough it felt like a forensic audit of my entire existence. I signed non-disclosure agreements that carried penalties severe enough to ensure I would sooner forget my own name than discuss my work. I was given a start date, a flight number to Las Vegas, and instructions to await further contact upon my arrival. I packed my bags with the detached optimism on a scientist embarking on a challenging new project, entirely unaware that I was, in fact, stepping into a meticulously managed reality where the laws of physics were treated as mere suggestions. The journey from Las Vegas was the first true indication of the isolation I had signed up for. A silent man in a black government-issue sedan drove me north, then east, away from the neon, dusted horizon and into the vast, brutal emptiness of the Nevada desert. The landscape unspooled in a monotonous panorama of baked earth and skeletal creosote, bushes under a sky of punishing, indifferent blue. The silence inside the car was as profound as the emptiness outside. After 3 hours, we turned onto an unmarked, paved road that stretched toward the distant, shimmering mountains like a black surgical scar on the flesh of the desert. Another hour passed before the facility came into view. It was not the gleaming, futuristic complex I might have imagined. It was a monument to brutalist architecture, a cluster of low, monolithic structures of raw, gray concrete and darkened, reflective glass that seemed to drink the harsh desert light and give nothing back. There was no sign, no fence, no visible security patrol. Only the stark, alien geometry of the buildings rising from the desert floor. It looked less like a research station and more like a mausoleum for a forgotten god. We pulled up to a subterranean entrance, a concrete ramp that descended into the earth. The air that greeted me as the car door opened was super heated and carried a strange, metallic tang, the scent of ozone and hot stone. My handler, a man named Elias Thorne, was waiting for me. He was tall, gaunt, and possessed a stillness that was deeply unsettling. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, and his eyes, when they met, seemed to be assessing true integrity rather than acknowledging my presence. He did not offer a handshake. "Dr. Finch," he said, his voice as dry as the desert air. "Welcome to Esoterra." He led me through a series of sterile, white corridors that hummed with the low, constant thrum of industrial-grade ventilation. The air grew cooler, drier. Our footsteps echoed with unnerving clarity in the sound, dampening environment. There were no decorations, no informational posters. Nothing to suggest human habitation, beyond the bare necessities of function. Thorne handed me a security badge bearing my name and photograph, a key to a small apartment in the on-site residential block, and a single, laminated card. "Your initial onboarding protocol," he stated, not explained. "Memorize it. Adherence is not optional." I took the card. I am a man accustomed to procedure, to checklists, to the rigorous protocols of a scientific laboratory. I read the card with the detached curiosity of a new employee, encountering a set of particularly stringent corporate policies, attempting to reverse engineer the logic behind each directive. The text was stark, black on white. Rule FAO 70. All personal biometric data must be purged from active terminals by 1900 local time. Compliance note: non-compliance will result in immediate revocation of system access and a mandatory cognitive assessment. Rule 512. All westward-facing exterior shutters must remain fully sealed between O2500 and O400. Compliance note: visual confirmation is logged automatically. Do not attempt manual override under any circumstances. A Rule FEN 15 fee: food and drink items are prohibited within Level 3 geological analysis. Water is permissible. Compliance note: atmospheric particulates in this sector are highly reactive to complex organic compounds. A Rule FE 21C: do not vocalize any numerical sequences discovered in raw resonance data. Transcribe only. Compliance note: auditory resonance can cause sensor feedback loops. My mind immediately set to work rationalizing them. Rule FAO 7: an extreme but plausible cybersecurity measure. Perhaps biometric data left on the network could create a vulnerability. The cognitive assessment was likely just bureaucratic jargon for a stern talking to and a password reset. Rule 515 fee: perfectly logical. sensitive atmospheric sensors could easily be contaminated by organic molecules. I had worked in clean rooms with far stricter rules. Rule 521C also sensible. If we were dealing with highly sensitive resonance detectors, it stood to reason that certain auditory frequencies, even those produced by the human voice, could create feedback and corrupt the data. Rule 512 was the only one that gave me pause. Sealing shutters during a specific 2-hour window in the middle of the night seemed oddly specific. Perhaps it was related to satellite surveillance, or light pollution affecting some kind of nocturnal optical sensor. In any case, it was a simple enough directive to follow. They were strange rules, yes, but they existed within a framework of logic I could accept. I slid the card into my pocket, my scientific mind satisfied that it had solved the small puzzle. My first shift in sub, Level 3, was a study in anticlimax. The lab was a vast, circular room, its walls lined with servers, and its center dominated by a holographic display that currently showed a slowly rotating, translucent image of the Earth's crust beneath our feet. My workstation was one of a dozen arranged in a wide circle, though only 3 others were occupied. My colleagues offered curt nods, but no conversation. The silence was broken only by the hum of the servers and the soft clicking of keyboards. The work itself was fascinating. The raw data streams detailed seismic and geological resonance patterns unlike anything I had ever seen. They were complex, semi-repeating, and possessed a level of structural coherence that bordered on artificial. Yet, they were not impossible. I theorized we could be observing a novel form of crystalline stress propagation or a previously undocumented magnetotelluric phenomenon. I spent hours engrossed, transcribing the numerical sequences as per Rule Phi 21, feeling the familiar thrill of scientific discovery. The day passed in a blur of focused work. It was 1915 when I finally packed my briefcase, my mind still churning with data. I walked back through the silent, sterile corridors toward the residential block, feeling a sense of satisfaction. It was only as I reached the door to my apartment that a cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. My terminal. In my haste and fascination, I had forgotten to purge my session. I had broken Rule 507 on my very first day. Cursing my own carelessness, I turned and hurried back toward the lab, my footsteps echoing my rising anxiety. The cognitive assessment was probably nothing, I told myself, but the thought of facing Elias Thorne to explain my incompetence on day 1 was mortifying. As I approached the entrance to sub Level 3, I slowed. The main door was propped open slightly. I could see a single workstation was still active inside, its monitor casting a flickering glow in the otherwise darkened lab. I crept closer, peering through the gap. It was a senior researcher I'd briefly seen earlier, a woman whose badge read Dr. Aris Thorne. No apparent relation to Elias, I hoped. She was hunched over her keyboard, typing with a frantic, desperate energy. Her screen was not displaying geological data. It was bathed in a pulsing, aggressive red light, and large, block letters flashed over and over her key. SSPSRQIRID, Puro Ofo Alatio, O Giderel Fauzo 7. Her back was to me, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her entire body was coiled like a spring. She was muttering to herself, the words too low to be distinct, but the tone one of pure, unadulterated terror. It was not the sound of someone frustrated by a system lockout. It was the sound of someone pleading. I stood frozen for a moment, my own forgotten login completely erased from my mind. The clinical, rationalized world I had constructed around this place began to crack. The cognitive assessment was not a reprimand. The rules were not just quirky corporate policy. I was witnessing the raw, terrified consequence of breaking one. And it was nothing I could explain away with logic. She never saw me. I backed away from the door as silently as I had approached, my heart hammering against my ribs. I retreated down the corridor, the image of her terrified face, illuminated by that pulsing red light, burned into my memory. My scientific curiosity had been my driving force for my entire life. But as I walked back to my small, concrete apartment in the heart of the Nevada desert, I felt it being replaced by something else, something cold and primal. I felt the first sharp prickle of genuine fear. Sleep did not come that first night. My small, concrete apartment, which had initially felt like a Spartan but acceptable temporary home, now felt like a tomb. Every creak of the building, every hum from the ventilation system, was amplified by my fear. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The image of Dr. Eris Thorne's terrified face seared onto the back of my eyelids. The pulsing red light of the warning screen. The frantic, pleading muttering. It was a scene that defied the sterile, rational environment the facility projected. I had broken the same rule she had. My terminal had been left active, my biometric data unsecured. Yet no one had come for me. No alarms had sounded in my room. My keycard still worked. This lack of consequence was, in its own way, more terrifying than a swift punishment. It implied a system of enforcement that was not automated and absolute, but selective, arbitrary. It meant that someone, or something, had known about my transgression and simply chosen not to act. The thought was chilling. The next morning, I walked to Level 3 with a sense of dread that felt like a physical weight on my shoulders. I half expected to be met by Elias Thorne and a pair of grim-faced security guards. Instead, the lab was just as it had been the day before, quiet and humming with latent energy. There were 3 other researchers present, the same ones from my first shift, but one workstation was conspicuously vacant. Dr. Eris Thorne's. Her desk was wiped clean. Not just tidy, but sterile. There was no personal mug, no stray papers. No indication that a human being had spent hours working there just the day before. It was as if she had been digitally and physically erased from existence. I settled at my own terminal, my hands trembling slightly as I logged in. The system greeted me with the standard interface. No warnings, no red screens. It was unnervingly normal. Throughout the morning, I tried to engage my colleagues in conversation, to casually probe for information. I started with the man nearest me, a portly, balding physicist named Dr. Jian Lai. Quiet morning. I began, my voice sounding strained to my own ears. Dr. Thorne must be taking a personal day. Dr. Lee didn't look up from his screen. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "I would advise you to focus on the data, Dr. Finch," he murmured, his tone flat and final. It was not a suggestion, it was a clear, unequivocal warning. I tried a similar approach with the other two researchers and received responses that were either equally evasive or outright ignored. They were afraid. The fear in this room was a palpable force, a low-frequency resonance that vibrated just beneath the surface of the professional silence. Eris, Thorne was gone, and we were all expected to pretend she had never been here at all. I took their advice. I threw myself into the work, hoping the familiar comfort of data analysis could build a wall against my growing paranoia. But the data itself offered no comfort. The resonance patterns we were monitoring were becoming more complex, more structured. They were not random geological noise. On my screen, the numerical sequences flowed in long, intricate strings that possessed the hallmarks of a sophisticated language. There were repeating motifs, syntactical structures, and a level of complexity that dwarfed any natural phenomena I had ever studied. My scientific mind reeled with the implications. We weren't listening to the Earth. We were eavesdropping on a conversation. Rule Fate 21, do not vocalize any numerical sequences, took on a terrifying new significance. What would happen if one were to speak these numbers aloud? Would it be like speaking a word of power? A command? A name? The temptation to whisper just a short sequence, to hear its cadence, was a maddening scientific impulse that I had to physically suppress. 2 weeks passed in this state of high, strung, silent tension. I followed the rules with the devotion of a zealot. I purged my terminal at 1859 every evening. I never brought so much as a coffee into the lab. I transcribed the endless, silent numbers. And every night, I would lie in bed and think about rule. All westward, facing exterior shutters, must remain fully sealed between 0200 and 0400. It was the one rule that dealt with the outside world. A world I was beginning to feel was not as empty as it appeared. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of the residential block, my window facing due west, looking out over a vast, featureless expanse of desert that stretched to the jagged black line of the distant mountains. Every night at 0200 sharp, a heavy, multi-layered metal shutter would slide down over the reinforced glass, sealing me in with a deafening thud. My curiosity festered. What was out there in the dark that the facility's administration was so desperate to keep us from seeing? The official rationale I'd invented, satellite surveillance, light pollution, now seemed laughably naive. One afternoon, a facility-wide memo appeared on our terminals, a single chilling addendum to the existing protocols. ADDNDMTO rel E512. Personnel are reminded that any attempt to record audio from the western exterior of the facility during the Yoder 2500 Yo 400 seal is a Level 4 protocol violation. The facility's acoustic dampening is rated sufficient for all operational requirements. That was it. That was the tipping point. They weren't worried about us seeing something. They were worried about us hearing it. The rule wasn't just about a visual phenomenon. It was about an auditory one so powerful that the thick concrete walls and soundproofed windows of this billion-dollar facility were considered merely sufficient to block it. My scientific training, the very core of my being, that demanded evidence and observation, could no longer be suppressed by fear. I had to know, but I wasn't foolish enough to break the rule directly. I couldn't use a microphone or a camera. I needed a low-tech, deniable method of observation. I needed a witness and had no voice and no memory that could be audited. That night, I devised a simple experiment. I took the plain glass tumbler from the bathroom and filled it with water, placing it carefully on the wide, interior sill of my westward-facing window. My hypothesis was simple. If there was a significant acoustic or vibratory event outside, it might be powerful enough to transmit through the structure of the building and disturb the surface of the water. It was a seismograph of the most primitive kind. I watched the clock, my heart rate accelerating as 002C100 approached. At the precise second, the shutter slammed down, the sound echoing through my small room like a gunshot. The silence that followed was absolute. I turned off the lights and sat in my desk chair, my eyes fixed on the glass of water, a pale circle in the gloom. For the first hour, nothing happened. The water remained as still as glass. I began to feel foolish, my paranoia getting the better of me. Then at 0307, I felt it. It wasn't a sound. It was a pressure. A deep, subsonic thrumming that started at the base of my skull and vibrated down my spine. As a geophysicist, I was intimately familiar with seismic vibrations, with the tremors of the earth. This was not that. This was directional. It was pressing in on the western face of the building, a physical force that the structure seemed to groan against. It was rhythmic, like a colossal heartbeat, or the purr of some impossibly large engine. I looked at the glass. My breath caught in my throat. On the surface of the water, tiny, concentric ripples were forming. They pulsed in perfect synchrony with the vibrations I felt in my bones. The patterns were intricate, geometric, like the somatic figures I had once created in a university lab, but infinitely more complex. They would form, hold for a second, and then dissolve as a new, more elaborate pattern emerged. It was mesmerizing and utterly terrifying. This was the source of the data. The geological resonance was not coming from beneath us. It was coming from out there. The thrumming, the pressure, the impossible ballot in the water glass. It all stopped at exactly 0400. The cessation was so abrupt that the resulting silence felt like a physical blow. I sat in the dark for a long time, my mind struggling to process what I had just witnessed. I had my proof. The rules were not arbitrary. They were a shield, protecting us from a phenomenon that was real, physical, and right outside our walls. I waited until the first hint of dawn grayed the sky before I moved. The shutters were programmed to retract at sunrise. I stood before the window, waiting. With a low hum, the heavy metal shield slid upwards, revealing the harsh beauty of the desert morning. I looked out, half expecting to see some great trench or piece of machinery. But there was nothing. Just sand, rock, and the indifferent blue sky. My eyes fell to the glass of water. It was still. but my gaze drifted past it to the exterior of the thick, reinforced window pane itself, and then I saw it. My blood ran cold. Pressed against the center of the glass, 5 feet from the nearest ledge and 3 stories up from the desert floor, was a handprint. It was perfectly formed in a thin layer of dust, as if someone had reached out and placed their palm flat against the window during the night. But the hand was impossibly long and slender, and it had 6 fingers. The handprint was a declaration of war against my sanity. I stood frozen before the window for what felt like an eternity, my scientific mind battling a tidal wave of primal terror. My first impulse was to recoil, to scrub the offending image from existence. My second, overriding impulse was that of the scientist. I had to document it. I couldn't use my phone. Any unauthorized photography was grounds for immediate termination, and likely far worse. So I grabbed a notepad and a pencil, my hands shaking so violently that my first few lines were jagged, meaningless squiggles. Forcing myself to breathe, I began to sketch, my mind grasping for the anchor of scientific process. I noted the dimensions. The palm was unnaturally narrow. The fingers elongated to nearly twice the length of my own. The 6th finger branched from the base of the palm, parallel to the thumb, giving the print a grotesque, arachnid symmetry. There were no discernible whorls or loops of a typical fingerprint, only a fine, stippled texture like worn leather. It was pressed against the glass 3 stories up, with no ledge, no scaffolding, no conceivable point of purchase. It was an artifact of an impossible event. I knew I couldn't report it. Reporting it would be an admission that I had, in some way, been observing the window during the O2 400 seal. It would expose me to the same scrutiny that had erased Dr. Eris Thorne. The handprint was my secret, a terrifying piece of data that I alone possessed. As the sun climbed higher, the warmth began to evaporate the thin film of condensation on the glass, and, with it, the dusty imprint began to fade. Within an hour, it was gone, leaving only my frantic sketch as proof it had ever existed. Walking into Level 3 that morning was like stepping into a different reality. The air, once merely sterile, now felt charged with a predatory stillness. The low hum of the servers sounded less like machinery and more like the breathing of a sleeping beast. I looked at the streams of numerical data flowing across my screen, the complex, semi-repeating sequences I had been so fascinated by. I was no longer looking at abstract geological resonance. I was looking at the written language of thing that had touched my window. The thought made my blood run cold. Every number I transcribed felt like handling a venomous snake. My self-imposed isolation was no longer sustainable. I needed an ally, or at the very least, a source of information beyond my own terrified deductions. My gaze fell upon Dr. Janley. He was older than the rest of us, a man who'd likely been at Esoterra for years. He had warned me off once, but the stakes had changed. The threat was no longer a vague administrative punishment. It was a 6-fingered hand on my window. I waited until a lull in the day. When the other 2 researchers had left for their lunch break, I walked over to Lee's workstation. He stiffened as I approached, his eyes fixed resolutely on his monitor. "Dr. Lee," I began, keeping my voice low and steady. "I need to ask you about Rule Fen 15. He didn't move. "The rule is clear, Dr. Finch. No complex organics in the lab. It's a simple contamination protocol. With all due respect," I pressed, "nothing in this facility is simple. I believe the atmospheric particulates mentioned in the compliance note are more than just dust." He finally turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw past his professional mask. His eyes were filled with a deep, weary fear. "You are a geophysicist, Finch. You study the Earth. Stick to that. Do not study the architecture of your cage." The word cage hung in the air between us. "Something was outside my window last night," I whispered, the confession feeling like a betrayal of my own survival instinct. It left a mark. Lai's face went pale. He glanced nervously toward the sealed lab door. "You saw nothing," he hissed. "Whatever you think you saw, you are mistaken. Forget it. Forgetting is a survival skill in this place." "I can't," I insisted. "The data we're transcribing, it's not geology, is it? It's a signal. It's their signal. And the particulates, they're connected to it, aren't they?" He stared at me for a long moment, a silent battle raging in his eyes. Finally, he leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "The particulates are receptive. Think of them as a raw medium, Dr. Finch. A substrate. They are inert, microscopic dust. But they are designed to react to two things: strong, coherent resonance patterns and complex organic molecules. The resonance gives them a blueprint. The organics give them fuel." My mind raced to process the horrific implication. Fuel for what? To build. Lee breathed, his eyes wide with remembered terror. "To assemble. A few years ago, a technician spilled a few drops of a protein shake near one of the primary server vents. The resonance patterns at that moment were unusually coherent. The dust in the air, it used the protein as a catalyst. It began to coalesce to form three-dimensional, tangible shapes that mirrored the data on the screens. It built a perfect, shimmering replica of a sequence we had just recorded. A string of numbers, glowing and hanging in the air, made of nothing but dust and a drop of spilled protein. I felt dizzy. Rule 15 wasn't about protecting the sensors from us. It was about protecting us from the data. It was to prevent the language of things outside from finding a way to physically manifest inside. Our conversation was cut short by the return of the other researchers, accompanied by a new face. He was young, probably a fresh post, Doc, with a cocky, self-assured swagger. Elias Thorne was with them, his gaunt presence sucking the warmth from the room. "This is Dr. Evans," Thorne announced, his voice flat. "He will be joining the analysis team, focusing on cross-referencing resonance patterns with deep, core temperature fluctuations." Evans gave a dismissive wave to the room. "Just point me at the rocks," he said with a grin, clearly unimpressed by the solemn atmosphere. Over the next week, Evans proved to be exactly what his first impression suggested: brilliant, arrogant, and utterly contemptuous of the rules. He saw them as bureaucratic nonsense, impediments to his real work. He openly scoffed at the prohibition of food and drink, complaining loudly about the lack of decent coffee. Lie and I exchanged worried glances. Evans was a walking protocol violation, a time bomb of carelessness. The inevitable happened on a Tuesday. We were in the middle of a resonance spike, the most powerful and sustained I had yet witnessed. The numbers pouring onto our screens were dense and complex, the language outside growing more insistent, more agitated. The pressure in the room felt immense, the air thick with unspoken tension. And then I smelled it. The rich, unmistakable aroma of dark roast coffee. I whipped my head around. Dr. Evans was leaning back in his chair, a triumphant smirk on his face, holding a large, stainless steel thermos. He had just poured himself a cup. "Relax, people," he said, taking a long, theatrical sip. "It's just coffee. What's the worst that could happen? The dust bunnies get a caffeine buzz." Dr. Lee shot to his feet, his face a mask of pure horror.
"Evans, you fool! Put it away!"
But it was too late. As Evans set the steaming cup down on his desk, a single drop of black coffee spilled over the rim, landing on the pristine, white surface of his workstation. The reaction was instantaneous and silent. The air around the spilled drop shimmered. The microscopic, invisible particulates we had been breathing, the receptive dust, were drawn to it. It was like watching iron filings align to a magnet, but in 3 dimensions. A small swirling vortex of glittering dust, no bigger than a fist, formed directly over the coffee droplet. The liquid was consumed, drawn up into the vortex, not as steam, but as a catalyst. The vortex began to glow with a soft, internal, blue-white light. And then it began to change. With a smooth, silent, and utterly horrifying precision, the swirling dust coalesced. It elongated, twisted, and solidified. Hanging in the air, exactly where the steam from the coffee cup should have been, was a glowing, 3-dimensional object. It was a perfect, tangible manifestation of the first numerical sequence on Evans's screen. The number 7, followed by a complex, alien glyph that looked like a stylized, 6-fingered hand. It pulsed with a soft, malevolent light, a piece of a language not meant for human eyes, now given physical form in our sterile lab. Evans stared, his arrogant smirk gone, replaced by slack-jawed terror. The thermos slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. The main lab door hissed open. Elias Thorne stood there, flanked by 2 security personnel in heavy, tactical gear. But he wasn't looking at Evans. His cold, assessing eyes were fixed on the glowing symbol hanging in the air. And on his face was not anger or surprise, but the grim, wary resignation of a man who knew this was not a breach of protocol, but a breach of containment. The silence in the lab was absolute, broken only by the frantic, ragged gasps of Dr. Evans. The glowing symbol, a piece of impossible language given form, hung in the air like a declaration of cosmic treason. Elias Thorne's reaction was not one of panic, but of chilling, practiced efficiency. He raised a small, black device from his belt and pointed it at the manifestation. He didn't speak. He simply pressed a button. There was no sound, but the air itself seemed to scream. The glowing glyph convulsed violently, its light flickering like a dying star. It folded in on itself, the elegant, alien lines collapsing into a chaotic scramble, before dissolving completely, falling to the floor as a shower of inert, gray dust. The two security personnel moved past Thorne with a terrifying, fluid grace. They didn't address the protocol violation. They addressed the violator. One clamped a hand over Evans's mouth to stifle his hysterical babbling, while the other lifted him from his chair. If he weighed nothing, he requires recalibration. Thorne stated, his voice as cold and empty as the space between galaxies. It was the most terrifying euphemism I had ever heard. They dragged Evans out of the lab, his muffled cries ceasing abruptly as the door hissed shut. Thorne turned his gaze to Dr. Lee and me. There was no anger, only a deep, abyssal wariness. "I see you've been educating our new colleague, Dr. Lee," he said, his tone making it clear he knew everything that had been said. "It saves time. You both understand, now, that the rules are not for our convenience. They are for our survival." He gestured to the holographic display in the center of the room. "We call it the Esoterra anomaly. It is not geological, Dr. Finch. It is biological, or perhaps mimetic. It is an intelligence of immense age and power, trapped deep within the lithosphere beneath our feet. It is not from space, it is from within. It doesn't perceive reality as we do. It sings it. The resonance patterns we record are its language, its thoughts, its attempts to find a sympathetic frequency in our world. This facility is not a laboratory. It is a dampener. A massive, billion-dollar tuning fork designed to keep the anomaly's song from finding harmony with our physical laws. As he spoke, a new alarm began to sound, a deep, guttural klaxon that vibrated in my bones. The primary lighting grid flickered and died, plunging the lab into the stark, crimson glow of the emergency system. On the central display, the translucent image of the Earth's crust vanished, replaced by a swirling, chaotic vortex of the alien glyphs and numerical sequences, all pulsing with an aggressive, triumphant light. "The breach," Lee whispered, his face ashen. "It gave the anomaly a taste, a foothold. It's pushing," Thorne confirmed, his voice tight. "The primary dampeners are fluctuating. It's trying to force a full manifestation. We have one option left. The scoring protocol." My blood ran cold. It sounded like an act of self-destruction. "It's a targeted seismic charge," Thorne explained, his eyes locked on me. "A last resort. We detonate a resonance pulse of our own, designed to disrupt the specific geological strata where the anomaly is focused. We can't destroy it, but we can detune its camber, force it back into a state of incoherent dormancy. Dr. Finch, your work here is no longer theoretical. I need you to target the charge. You can read the propagation data. You understand the wave mechanics better than any of us. You are the only one who can make this shot." The choice was not a choice. It was a conscription. We ran from the lab, down corridors that now seemed actively hostile. The air was thick with shimmering dust, coalescing in the corners of my vision, in fleeting geometric shapes. The numerical sequences were no longer confined to screens. They were etching themselves onto the concrete, walls in faint, glowing lines, a constant, silent scream. We passed an open doorway to a small break room. On a table sat a forgotten, half-eaten apple. The organic matter had become a nucleus for a pulsating, tumorous mass of crystalline fibers that twitched and grew even as we watched. A grotesque fusion of orchard and alien geometry. Our destination was sub-level 7, the seismic core. The journey felt like a descent into hell. The vibrations grew stronger with every level we descended, the klaxon a constant, maddening heartbeat. The core was a vast, spherical chamber, its walls a mesh of conduits and glowing sensors. In the center, suspended in a web of magnetic containment fields, was the scorer, a massive, drill-like device tipped with a complex array of resonance emitters. A single control console stood on a gantry overlooking it. The vibrations were now so intense that the metal floor hummed, and my teeth ached in my skull. The air was alive with dust, forming and dissolving six-fingered hands that reached for us from the shadows. Lee and Thorne stood back to back, using handheld sonic emitters to dissipate the larger manifestations that swirled around us. Finch,
Now!
Thorne yelled over the din. I scrambled onto the gantry, my hands flying over the console. The screen was a waterfall of the anomaly's language, but interwoven with it was the seismic data I understood. I had to isolate the primary frequency of the anomaly, calculate the precise counter frequency, and aim the scorer at a point 5 miles beneath our feet, a task requiring hundreds of minute calculations. As I worked, the numbers on the screen began to speak in my mind. It was not a sound, but a direct transmission of concepts, of knowledge, of promises of understanding the fabric of the universe. A six-fingered hand of pure thought reached into my consciousness, offering to guide my fingers to show me the correct answer. It was the ultimate temptation, the final test of Rule Phi 21. I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing only on the pure mathematics, on the cold, hard physics. I ignored the siren song of the numbers. I saw the target solution, a fleeting window of opportunity. With a guttural cry, I locked in the final coordinates and slammed my palm down on the large, red activation panel. The klaxon stopped. The vibration ceased. The world did not erupt in fire and thunder, but in its opposite. A wave of pure, absolute silence expanded from the scorer. It was not the absence of sound. It was the sound of absence. A null wave that erased everything it touched. I saw it wash over the coalescing dust, forms turning them to nothing. I saw it hit Lie and Thorne, their forms dissolving like smoke. I felt it coming for me, a wave of perfect, cleansing oblivion. And then, nothing. I awoke to the sting of grit in my eyes and the heat of a rising sun on my face. I was lying in the sand, miles from the facility, or where the facility had been. In the distance, a vast, smoking crater scared the desert floor, a wound in the earth that was still weeping smoke into the morning sky. I was alone. I staggered to my feet, my body aching. I checked my pockets, my wallet, my keys, and the single, laminated card with the rules. I started walking towards the distant, shimmering line of the highway, a lone survivor of a war no one knew had been fought. I am writing this now from a cheap motel room, hundreds of miles away. I am writing it because I have to. I am the only record. But that is not the only reason. I am writing because the silence did not last. The numbers are still in my head. They are a part of me now, etched into my memory, my DNA. Sometimes I find myself humming a sequence without realizing it. A complex, resonant melody that makes the lights flicker. I can feel the resonance of the earth wherever I go. A low, constant hum that is growing stronger. I am a carrier. I am the escape song. I fear I am just looking for the right catalyst. A spilled drink. A moment of weakness. A single drop of blood. Just now, as the evening sun slanted through the grimy window, I saw it. There, on the dusty glass, perfectly clear in the fading light. A handprint. My handprint. And it has 6 fingers.